for the past 15 days. We always begin our legislative meetings with a moment of silence. We can say the names, and almost always like Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Breonna Taylor. We have plenty to reflect. But even that is not new. The nation, our city, we can cite events like George Floyd or Rodney King, a moment where Selma, we are confronting the vestiges of slavery. And maybe, as we do, white Americans can see that for Black Americans, continuity of racism in our society. Today, we have an important bill before us to address police conduct. Surely white actors think they understand, and there is more we can do. But as we are about to have this moment of silence, I ask that each of us reflect on what also needs to change, but which we cannot legislatively change. For the past 15 our understanding of each other and our attitudes. We can say the names. Somehow we have to change deeply rooted Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Breonna often unconscious attitudes. But even that is within ourselves that allow racism. We can cite events like George Floyd or Rodney King, or how do we end or Tulsa? I ask for a moment of silence, as we do, white Americans reflect. But which we cannot legislatively change. Our understanding of each other and our attitudes. Somehow we have to change deeply rooted attitudes, often unconscious attitudes within ourselves that allow racism to persist in our society. How do we end this? Madam Secretary, would you call the roll of silence to reflect?
Councilmember Allen.
Here.
Councilmember Bonds is having some difficulties, so she will be joining us shortly. Councilmember Che.
Here.
Councilmember Gray.
Here.
Councilmember Grosso.
Present.
Councilmember McDuffie.
Here.
Chairman Mendelson.
Present.
Councilmember Nadeau.
Here.
Councilmember Silverman.
Present.
Councilmember Todd.
Present.
Councilmember Robert White.
Present.
Councilmember Trayon White.
Present.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Could you please explain the presence of Councilmember Bonds?
At this moment, she is on the line, but she is trying to formally connect with her video and audio. So hopefully she will be joining shortly. I am troubleshooting with her, but she should be joining shortly.
Does that mean that she's able to vote?
Not at this moment, but shortly, hopefully.
Because we have the consent agenda before us, and it would be a bit unfair to proceed with her trying to get into the meeting and her not being able to. Should we pause for a minute?
It may take a couple minutes because she is rebooting her computer at this moment. May I suggest that we move on, and should we need to reconsider, we can come back to reconsider.
Okay, that's a little inefficient, but I'll do that. So we'll do the consent agenda, and Madam Secretary, if you would tell me when she joins, I'll move to reconsider. We have the consent agenda before us. Are there any changes to the consent agenda? I am not seeing anyone raise their hand, and I'm not hearing anyone ask to be recognized. I assume there are no changes to the consent agenda. I do want to note that there are 4 ceremonial resolutions. I think this is the first time we've had ceremonials on the agenda since March 17th. The fact that we will be approving them does not mean that they will be printable. The Secretary's already indicated to members that there's still some difficulty with the Secretary's office being able, because of teleworking, to be able to print for presentation the ceremonials. So we can approve them, but it still may be a delay before they can be presented. I'll ask for the vote on the consent agenda, and Madam Secretary, you'll have to call the roll.
And Mr. Chairman, Councilmember Bonds has joined us, so just in time.
Excellent.
Councilmember Allen.
Yes.
Councilmember Bonds.
Yes.
Councilmember Che.
Yes.
Councilmember Gray,
Yes.
Councilmember Grasso,
Yes.
Councilmember McDuffie,
Yes.
Chairman Mendelson,
Yes.
Councilmember Nadeau,
Yes.
Councilmember Silverman,
Yes.
Councilmember Todd,
Yes.
Councilmember Robert White,
Yes.
Councilmember Trayon White.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, there are 12 yeses.
I'll send this to Chairman's.
The consent agenda is approved unanimously. We will turn to the non-consent agenda.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, did we just the Secretary's report?
I left out the most important part of the meeting. I'm sorry.
I don't feel valued this morning.
That is such a mistake. My apologies to everyone. We will go back to item 5, which is introduction and referral of proposed legislation. We have the Secretary's report of introductions. I will recognize, I am so bad, I apologize. I will recognize the Chair Pro Tem, the Councilmember from Ward 5, Kenya McDuffie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I move to waive the reading of the Secretary's report of introduction.
There's been a motion to waive the reading of the Secretary's report of introductions. We could do a roll call on this. I think what I'll do is ask if there are any objections, and if there are no objections, it will be unanimous consent. Are there any objections? Madam Secretary, will you confirm we see no objections and hear no objections?
Confirmed, Mr. Chairman.
All right, so the Secretary's report is approved. Thank you. We'll turn now to the non-consent agenda. And the first items under the non-consent agenda are final reading and vote on temporary legislation. And the first item is Bill 23-744, Foreclosure Moratorium Temporary Amendment Act of 2020. Councilmember Nadeau.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw the measure.
The measure is withdrawn. The second measure is Bill 23-751, Coronavirus Omnibus Temporary Amendment Act of 2020, which was moved by me on behalf of all members, I believe at the May 5th meeting, and I am withdrawing that. The third temporary for final reading is Bill 23-758, Coronavirus Support Temporary Amendment Act of 2020. Without objection, I'm going to move consideration of this to the end of the meeting. And that is so that it can be amended to reflect any changes to the emergency, which we will turn to in a minute. So if there's no objection, the Bill 23-758 is moved to the end of the agenda. So we will turn now to reading and vote on emergency legislation. And the first item is Bill 23-776, Coronavirus Support Clarification Emergency Amendment Act of 2020. Before we consider it, we have to approve the declaration, which is PR 23-827. This is the latest in a series of emergency bills that we've considered to deal with the public health emergency and various provisions. I'm going to go quickly through what this bill does. It was first circulated as a draft last Thursday. I think there was a revised draft circulated over the weekend. And if I'm wrong, it was circulated yesterday morning. And then what is before us was circulated yesterday around 6 o'clock, I believe. The bill makes minor amendments to clarify a reporting requirement that was raised by the delivery industry with regard to third-party deliveries of food from restaurants or meals from restaurants. There are several changes to the provision concerning tenant payment plans, clarifications to restore eligibility criteria that was inadvertently removed during the May 19th legislation. The new language is identical to what was approved by the council on May 5th. We understand that AOBA offered a rewrite of the residential payment plans this weekend, but in consulting with several council members, there were concerns, and so that is not included in this. The emergency before us clarifies eligibility for residential properties, commercial retail space, and any other commercial space under 6,500 square feet. In that regard, I want to make clear that it is the intent of this legislation that retail space includes bars, restaurants, and other retailers. And the fact that we don't specifically enumerate types of retailers does not mean that bars and restaurants are not included. They are. There's a provision in this emergency concerning rent freeze, which we approved, I think, on March 17th. And the provision here clarifies application of the rent freeze is for residential properties, commercial retail space, again, including restaurants and bars, and any other commercial space under 6,500 square feet. There's a clarification regarding the microgrant program for businesses, makes a clarification that concerning eligibility that's at the request of the executive and Councilmember McDuffie. There's a provision concerning a public health emergency response grant program. This is a new program, so this is a new provision, not just amending what we did on May 19th. Is at the request of the executive for grants to promote prevention and awareness of COVID-19. There's a new provision concerning ABRA outdoor licenses. It's an ABRA provision to support the reopening guidance, which allows for food and beverage service outdoors at restaurants. There's a clarifying amendment concerning FMLA, removing the phrase, quote, family and medical, unquote, in several places that should not have been in the law. And this was my understanding from Councilmember Silverman, working with the Department of Employment Services. There's a new provision concerning living wills. I believe this came from the Judiciary Committee or its chairman, that allows for the electronic witnessing of living wills. It complements what we've already done regarding e-notarization and other electronic witnessing procedures. There's a provision in this bill that approves the Events DC contract that was submitted last Friday to disperse $15 million in funds to restaurants, hotels, and undocumented workers. I believe some of that distribution comes with a contract that's already been approved by the council, but including this provision here allows the next steps to move more quickly with regard to getting the funds out to undocumented workers. I want to note that this provision, unlike all the ones I've already itemized, will not be included in the temporary bill. We only have to approve the contract once. And finally, in this emergency, there is approval of the symbolic designation of Black Lives Matter Plaza. As we all know, the mayor acted last week, and I think most of us agree with her action to symbolically name the plaza, even though that requires council action. So we are moving today to approve that. It will not be in the temporary, and I will be, before the next meeting, introducing a standalone, my notes here say standalone emergency, temporary, and permanent. And I will ask members if they want to co-introduce that. So those are the provisions that are in this emergency. As I said, the last two, the Events DC contract and the symbolic name designation, will not be in the temporary. I move the declaration. Is there discussion? Councilmember Silverman?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to highlight one of the things you mentioned, which is the contract that we are approving today for Events DC to work with the Community Foundation to distribute $5 million to our undocumented workers. This was a debate we had a few meetings ago about how we can help our residents who are not eligible for unemployment insurance. I just want to say thank you to everyone. I think you were involved in discussions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the Events DC board. There's more we can do, of course, but I think this is a good start, and I'm glad to finally see the money get dispersed to our residents who truly need it at this time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Silverman. And yes, I've had many conversations with Greg Odell from Events DC about how we were getting, or they are getting that money out the door. And I won't go through all the details, but when they landed on this contract, I worked with him, or he worked with us, so that it could get over here in time for us to fast track approve it with this legislation. I do want to note, because I didn't mention this, there is a provision in this emergency that, again, I didn't note, that it folds in an emergency that Councilmember Robert White had noticed last week, and that has to do with credit reporting. And it speaks to the use of credit reports. So I want to thank Robert for working with the industry and working with me. And so what we have in this bill reflects a few changes that from what had originally been introduced, but still I think faithful to what Mr. White had intended. So I overlooked mentioning that when I described what was in the bill, but that is in this bill. Is there further discussion? On the declaration, Madam Secretary, would you call the roll?
Councilmember Bonds,
Yes.
Councilmember Bonds votes yes. Councilmember Che,
Yes.
Councilmember Che votes yes. Councilmember Gray, Councilmember Gray,
Yes.
Councilmember Gray votes yes. Councilmember Grasso,
Yes.
Councilmember Grasso votes yes. Councilmember McDuffie,
Yes.
Councilmember McDuffie votes yes. Chairman Mendelson,
Yes.
Chairman Mendelson votes yes. Councilmember Nadeau, Councilmember Nadeau,
Yes.
Councilmember Nadeau votes yes. Councilmember Silverman,
Yes.
Councilmember Silverman votes yes. Councilmember Todd,
Yes.
Councilmember Todd votes yes. Councilmember Robert White,
Yes.
Councilmember Robert White votes yes. Councilmember Trayon White,
Yes.
Councilmember Trayon White votes yes. Councilmember Allen,
Yes.
Councilmember Allen votes yes. Mr. Chairman, there are 12 yeses.
The declaration is approved unanimously. We have the underlying bill. Let me just check with staff for a second. We have the underlying bill, which I described when I moved the declaration. This is the bill that circulated yesterday evening about 6 o'clock. I believe I have no oral amendments. I have no amendments, and I'm not aware of any amendments from members. Is there discussion on the bill? This is Bill 23-776. Madam Secretary, since we had a unanimous roll call, I think what I'll do here is we can go through the roll, but I'm going to recommend instead that we just do a voice vote.
Absolutely.
Pause for the nays to see. So all those in favor of the bill say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Are there any nays? Madam Secretary, I'm unaware of any nay votes.
I don't see any opposition, Mr. Chairman.
The measure is approved unanimously. We'll turn to the second emergency on the agenda, which is Connected Transportation Network Emergency Declaration Resolution of 2020, BR 23-825. Councilmember Che.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along with Council Members Allen and Nadeau, I'm moving the Connected Transportation Network Emergency Declaration Resolution and the Emergency Act of 2020. Under this legislation, DDOT would be required to publish a report that creates a connected network for cyclists and other non-motorists to traverse the district during the public health emergency and during the recovery period. The network is to be made up of protected bike lanes, expanded public space such as sidewalks, and of streets closed to through traffic. The legislation requires DDOT to implement the report on a staggered timeline basis, 20 miles by September 1st and an additional 5 miles by November 1st. The emergency is necessary as residents try to find new ways to commute and exercise while also observing social distancing rules. This is a once in a generation, maybe once in a lifetime opportunity to create the network for vulnerable road users to traverse the district. Over the next few months, as residents begin returning to work, we want to incentivize residents to bike, walk, or scooter to work rather than drive their cars and add to what is likely to be very congested roads. I understand, this is just on the emergency, of course, so I'd like to move the emergency, but I also understand that Councilmember Trahan White may have an amendment, which I am open to accepting as friendly and make some comment about when we get to that point. But for now, I'd like to just move the emergency declaration.
Thank you, Councilmember Che. We have the declaration before us. Is there discussion?
Chairman Mendelson.
Councilmember Nadeau.
Yes, thank you. I want to thank Council members Che and Allen for their work on this legislation. For several weeks, I've expressed disappointment at the district's slow or non-existent response in modifying our streets to respond to the public health emergency. We've watched as nearly all of our peer cities effectively use their streets and public space to ensure the health and safety of their residents. Cities like Oakland, which has already created over 70 miles of open streets and started by working with Black and Brown residents in East Oakland that have been the site of the most fatal crashes. If anyone has been downtown in the last week, it's easy to recognize the power of our streets and public spaces, who feels ownership over them, who feels safe navigating them, and how we enforce their use. Our streets are DC's largest asset, and right now we're not effectively using them to keep our residents safe from fear of violence, fear of dangerous traffic, and from a lack of space to socially distance. For these reasons, it's important to me that DDOT be the only agency mentioned in this legislation. We are not talking about street festivals or special events, and it would be inappropriate for policing to be necessary in a job meant for cones or barriers. After all, DC residents have been having block parties and claiming streets to meet their needs on their own for decades, and I see this as no different. I'm glad DDOT has started to move forward on slow street modifications, and I look forward to having this bill codify and expand those efforts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Nadeau. Is there further discussion on the declaration?
Mr. Chairman?
Councilmember McDuffie?
Well, you know, should I wait to discuss the amendment? I just want to make sure that there's an opportunity to talk about what the amendment does.
Well, we're on the declaration, so
I'll wait till we get to the act.
If there's no further discussion, Madam Secretary, would you call the roll?
Councilmember Che.
Yes.
Councilmember Che votes yes. Councilmember Gray.
Yes.
Councilmember Gray votes yes. Councilmember Grasso.
Yes.
Councilmember Grasso votes yes. Councilmember McDuffie.
Yes.
Councilmember McDuffie votes yes. Chairman Mendelson.
Yes.
Chairman Mendelson votes yes. Councilmember Nadeau.
Yes.
Councilmember Nadeau votes yes. Councilmember Silverman.
Yep.
Councilmember Silverman votes yes. Councilmember Todd.
Yes.
Councilmember Todd votes yes. Councilmember Robert White.
Yes.
Councilmember Robert White votes yes. Councilmember Trahan White.
Yes.
Councilmember Trahan White votes yes. Councilmember Allen.
Yes.
Councilmember Allen votes yes. Councilmember Bonds.
Yes.
Councilmember Bonds votes yes. Mr. Chairman, there are 12 yeses.
The declaration is approved unanimously. We have the underlying bill, Bill 23-772. Councilmember Che?
Yes, thank you. This is essentially requiring DDOT to provide a report showing exactly where these miles of protected lanes and protected spaces for pedestrians and others will be, and a timeline for that. Now, we were going to go further and actually require particular actions, but that would involve a cost, and in the emergency actions, we can't add to the budget in that way. At least that's my understanding. And so basically it is a reporting requirement with time requirements. Now, the report is supposed to involve all 8 wards, but I understand, and Mr. Trayon White can speak for himself, that he would like to take Ward 8 out of the reporting requirement. I find that disappointing because I believe that there are many people in Ward 8 who would be advantaged by having the scheme include Ward 8. But Mr. White, I understand, and again, he can speak for himself, says that his residents don't want this. And in deference to his representation of Ward 8, if he wants to pursue that amendment, then I would defer and accept it as friendly. But otherwise, I move the bill.
Thank you, Councilmember Che. Councilmember White, did you want to be recognized?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Che, for your words. Well, I am the Councilmember Ward 8, and I do listen to residents of Ward 8 more than most, I would say. So I'll be brief. For Ward 8, DDOT has not definitely identified a location connected transportation network. One site proposed was 15th Street from Mississippi Avenue to Savannah Street, 15th Place to Alabama Avenue to Bruce Place. If the intent is to have closure of streets, reduction of traffic lanes, and conversion of a street from 2-way to 1-way for cars, may not be a workable solution. We went through this several times with DDOT. Another problematic issue is that one adult resident who is at least 21 years old can make a request for the entire street. I don't think that is fair for the entire street. I've heard from more residents who do not want the bike lanes and fewer place to park. In fact, we went through this on Alabama Avenue, in which DDOT had to go back because several seniors complained that they can't get out their car and walk to their house, had to walk down the street through an alley just to be able to park to get their groceries to the house or just to go in the house. So we've heard that from many residents. There are a few residents who do want bike lanes, but it's not in comparison to those who don't want the bike lanes. And so I respectfully ask my colleagues to support my amendment for the Connected Transportation Network Emergency Amendment Act of 2020, that no modifications should be implemented in Ward 8.
Mr. Chairman.
Let me just be clear. So, Mr. White, you circulated the amendment.
Yes.
I have a printed copy. So you're moving that amendment at this time?
Yes.
Okay. I think I heard Councilmember McDuffie has to be recognized.
Yes, just trying to understand this measure. It is called the Connected Transportation Network Emergency Act of 2020. It is referencing Mayor Bowser's recent order, which is 2020-067, with respect to COVID-19 and the district's reopening. It goes on to mention the Connected Transportation Network Emergency Act of 2020 requires DDOT. So I guess I'm trying to make sure, is this something that is limited to actions that DDOT should take around how we would facilitate social distancing and the ability of people to commute back and forth as the city reopens? or does this go further than that? Does this go further than that?
Can I respond, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman, to Councilmember Chase.
Okay.
Councilmember Chase.
Yeah, the idea is that this is a report by DDOT about how it would identify this system, and that it would be it would allow them to make plans for all uses of the roadways, for commuting, for public use, and that it's prompted by the public health emergency. And I'm looking for the particular language. So it's for the duration of the public health emergency and for a period thereafter. Trying to get this correct. Hang on one second. Still not finding it, forgive me. But for a period thereafter, but I have to identify what that period is, but I'm not seeing it straight away. Oh, 270 days, I see it. So it would be for the period of the public health emergency and for 270 days thereafter.
So let me just make sure I'm clear. I apologize for slowing this process down, but you said what would be for the period of a public health emergency and 270 days after? Well,
This report would be to identify places where DDOT would consider bike lanes, expansion of the public sidewalk, or other actions to make it easier for people to maintain social distancing and at the same time be able to commute. And the expectation would be it would also give DDOT the opportunity over that period of time to see how this works and for the community to see how it works and whether thereafter they would maintain it or not. Now, as you know, DDOT has the capacity to set things up not in stone, so to speak, but with those large plastic barriers and so on. And so it could identify areas in this report and then pursue it to the extent they can over the period of the public health emergency and 270 days after that. You're muted, Will.
So this is actually more than a report that would allow for recommendations. This is a report that would allow them also some sort of authority to implement these recommendations for a period of the public health emergency and 270 days after. How would there then be input? Like what's the process to allow for input and feedback? I noted Councilmember Trayon White's amendment. I think it does make sense to have them to look into this and do a report and provide recommendations. I guess my concern would then be moving forward recommendations without the adequate input of people who would be impacted by it. And how would that process play out? How do you envision that process playing out in a time frame? Because I also note that you say that Section 3 says that this bill, the Connected Transportation Network Emergency Amendment Act of 2020, be adopted after a single reading. Now it's emergency, right? Was this not an emergency? This is not.
It is. We passed the emergency. This is the underlying bill.
Oh, okay. This is the underlying bill, but it's referred to as an emergency in the underlying bill.
Yes.
That's a little confusing. So
basically, Councilmember, I understand if I do understand your question. DDOT has the authority now to, for example, close streets. This directs how they should identify which ones to act on.
Okay.
And they already have that authority, and it encompasses, the usual things that DDOT does, the notifications and the all of the procedural kinds of rules, but this says, and it's supposed to be the impetus for them actually to move forward. Identify these areas and by a time certain, take it up.
Okay.
That's essentially what it is.
Okay, yeah, no, I just want to make sure that whatever processes are ordinarily in place when DDOT closes streets will remain in place so that people can provide feedback. I think this is important for them to move forward with. I was concerned that it somehow sort of expanded their authority or would eliminate certain processes that would allow the sort of feedback I think is necessary to make this work for different communities.
No, fair enough. But I don't see this as expanding their authority.
Okay. Okay. All right, I don't have any further questions. I thank you for the explanation.
Thank you, Councilmember McDuffie. We have Councilmember Trayon White's amendment number 1 before us. Am I correct? Because we got 2 amendments, Councilmember White?
Yes, and it's a second one which speaks to section 3. Can I read that real quick?
Well, you only moved number 1, so let's dispense with that, and then we'll go to number 2. Is there any further discussion on amendment number 1 from Mr. White? We'll do this by whether there's objection. It will be approved without objection. I'm waiting to see if there's any objection. Hearing none, amendment number 1 is approved. Amendment number 2, Mr. White? You're muted, Mr. White.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Yep.
Yes.
So the second amendment speaks to section 3, part 4, line 103, and is amending by adding new subsection G to read as follows. Section G, no modifications to streets may be made toward a pursuant section. End quote.
Can I just say, there is no section 3 anymore. That was removed from the bill.
Okay.
Okay.
I do want to note that amendment number 1 seems to speak to line 40, and amendment number 2 speaks to line 43 and 46. Now, I've not looked closely at the bill. Is that an important distinction so that we still need to consider that aspect of amendment number 2? Mr. White?
Yes, I'm not sure of the latest version, but the version I saw at those sections, yes, I'm not sure when the latest version was, to make sure it was clarity inside the bill. But if it's not in it, then we'll withdraw it.
Okay, because the amendment referencing the line numbers for the bill are line numbers from what we circulated last week, and that has changed since what was filed last night. So okay. That's where we are.
So just so I'm clear, and I hate to, I don't know if this is my time, I know it's still Councilmember White. I just want to make sure I'm looking at the same bill that you're referencing, because I see a section 3, and maybe I have the old version.
I am looking at the moment, which is why I'm being quiet.
The filed version doesn't have a section 3.
Let's do this because there's a little bit of confusion, at least on my part. Madam General Counsel.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
In amendment number 1, which has been approved without objection, Councilmember White moved to strike the phrase "this subsection," inserting the phrase "this subsection, except no modification shall be implemented in Ward 8" in its place. And that can be found on line 40. Do you think that you have latitude to consider whether that same change needs to be made on line 44 and line 40?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm actually trying to find the version that was circulated yesterday as well. That's not the version that we had.
It's on the screen.
I see it now. Thank you. Yep, we can do that.
So that then we don't need to consider amendment number 2 because you have the latitude to see whether the same change should be made on line 44.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you.
So Councilmember White, it would appear that amendment number 2 is unnecessary.
Correct.
So it's withdrawn?
Yes, I withdraw that one, Chairman.
Okay, so let's be clear. Amendment number 1 was approved, and General Counsel's indicated that she will look at line 44 to see whether the same change needs to be made there. I don't think the word subsection appears on line 46 or 47.
Mr. Chairman, just so I'm clear, and again, I'm supporting this, but I'm just trying to be clear. You just put something up on the screen, or someone put something up on the screen that had section 3 as the fiscal impact. What I have, which I think was circulated yesterday, doesn't look like that.
So, Councilmember McDuffie, what was actually filed close to 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon is what I just shared on the screen, and I will do it again so that you can see the actual final filed version.
So let me note, this is something that we need to get used to with virtual meetings. As I understand it, the draft has to be circulated, which was on Thursday. That the final has to be filed, but doesn't have to be circulated, which it was around 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon.
It was filed and circulated yesterday afternoon.
Okay, I have the impression from several members that it may not have been circulated, but whether that's the case or not, it also is linked on the agenda so that members can find the filed version on the agenda. I think it would be helpful if, in fact, what is the final filed is circulated in all instances. And I say that understanding that the Secretary said that Councilmember Che's office did circulate what was filed around 5 o'clock yesterday.
I have it now, thank you.
Okay, so the bill that we have has a substantive section 2, which ends on line 48, and then the fiscal impact section 3 begins on line 49. And that's what we are voting on. It has had one amendment. It was moved by Mr. White that General Counsel may tech with regard to subsection 2D. Is there further discussion on the bill? Hearing none. We have the bill as amended before us.
Mr. Chairman, I just have just a point of information. Am I to understand that through this process, there will ultimately be a report which will include opportunity for community to accept the report and to therefore know what, as a part of the report, might be the changes that would occur in their community?
Councilmember.
Yes,
I guess
there is no community input on the designated areas. DDOT will identify these and present them. And then in terms of DDOT acting on them, it would have to work with the community in the same way that it ordinarily would. There's no increase in its authority as such.
Well, you know, I guess I'm indirectly questioning their authority that they apparently have, where they can make a decision in a community. And I just heard that one individual can affect what happens in an entire community. And I ask these questions because my neighbor the other day wanted me to sign on to put additional speed humps on my street. I've lived here for 25 years. I've been through the speed humps. He's new and he thought we needed another speed hump. And he was informing me that, well, I think I have at least 10% of the neighbors, but just wanted to check in with you. And it makes me feel uncomfortable that one or two individuals can change how others in a community have access to what they think that they have a right to. You know, I feel like in this day and era when everyone is concerned with the rights of individuals, we have to be pretty careful about what we as an elected body determines is good and well. And I would like to err more on the side of including comment from community. So that was why, that's the nature of my inquiry.
Okay, Councilmember Bonds, we no longer have a section that allows a sole resident to request a street closure. So that isn't in there. But even if it were in there, the way it was drafted, it would allow them to request that DDOT do that, not that it be done. But it's not in there anymore.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I was about to proceed to a vote on the bill as amended. And I guess, Madam Secretary, why don't you call the roll?
Councilmember Gray. Councilmember Gray.
Yes.
Councilmember Gray votes yes. Councilmember Grasso.
Yes.
Councilmember Grasso votes yes. Councilmember McDuffie.
Yes.
Councilmember McDuffie votes yes. Chairman Mendelson.
Yes.
Chairman Mendelson votes yes. Councilmember Nadeau.
Yes.
Councilmember Nadeau votes yes. Councilmember Silverman.
Yes.
Councilmember Silverman votes yes. Councilmember Todd.
Yes.
Councilmember Todd votes yes. Councilmember Robert White.
Yes.
Councilmember Robert White votes yes. Councilmember Trayon White.
Yes.
Councilmember Trayon White votes yes. Councilmember Allen.
Yes.
Councilmember Allen votes yes. Councilmember Bonds.
Yes.
Councilmember Bonds votes yes. Councilmember Che.
Yes.
Councilmember Che votes yes. Mr. Chairman, there are 12 yeses.
The measure is approved unanimously. The next item, the third item on the under emergencies is Bill 23-774, Comprehensive Policing and Justice Reform Emergency Amendment Act of 2020. First, we have to consider and approve PR 23-826, the emergency declaration. Councilmember Allen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. A few months ago, this past fall, I went with a campaign for the fair sentencing of youth to their annual convening down in Montgomery, Alabama. And the purpose of that convening was for justice leaders, including many middle-aged men and women of color who'd served extreme sentences for crimes that they committed as children, to look inward, to build community, and to strategize. And it was a profoundly affecting trip, made me reflect on my own upbringing in the Deep South and my duty to pursue justice, no matter the obstacles or the people in power who stand in the way, and really to hone in on the most pressing reforms needed in the district. We also visited Bryan Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative's Legacy Museum, where I learned about the evolution of slavery into mass incarceration, and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which was a deeply affecting visualization of racial terror lynchings throughout our country, which included right here in the Capital Region. So if there's one message I want to get across today, it's this. I think that we are on a journey of truth and reconciliation. We're struggling with this history that isn't history, and we all need to face it. And there are ways that we can make our city safer, but it's just uncomfortable to speak truth to that tough on crime power. But I really don't know when we're going to do it if we can't do it right now. America is watching lynchings of Black people in the street by police, albeit with bullets and knees. Our president is threatening to call out dogs on Black residents and inciting terror. I've watched as police are flagrantly hitting, kicking, trampling, driving over, shooting, paralyzing, and blinding protesters while they protest police brutality. We're also hearing the narrative that we don't need to look at our own house, that injustice just happens anywhere but here, and that we're all just bystanders, or that if we reform our own systems, we'll somehow be less safe. I think that's destructive, and it ignores the very real experiences of many district residents, and it's just plain wrong. So to bring this home, this council, the pre-home rule bodies before it, and Congress are the primary architects of the district status as having one of the highest, if not the highest, mass incarceration rates in the world. We've passed laws with extreme sentences. We've criminalized social ills, real or perceived, to give us comfort. And when we want to undo some of those laws, just to decriminalize a ride on the metro. We don't have racial disparities in our criminal justice system because it's almost exclusively comprised of people of color. We have 70,000 people with criminal records in our city of 700,000 residents. Our incarcerated residents are shipped off all across the country with no contact with their families for literally decades. And residents' troubling experiences with policing by our own law enforcement agencies are empirically and anecdotally documented, but still, we just don't want to look in the mirror. Today's bill is a great step forward. Its components are incredibly important that cover both policing and criminal justice reform, but the need for systemic change is so great, we need to have a real dialogue, a very uncomfortable dialogue about the political courage it will take to actually dismantle what we have built and our complicity with federal prosecutors this led to, and that our use of arrests and incarceration and fines and fees to solve our problems has led to disappeared generations of Black Washingtonians. We all must connect policing reform to criminal justice reform, to education reform, to housing reform, to election reform. We also must rise to the challenge of breaking down silos and what separates us. So rather than talking about any of the specific components of this bill, and there are many, let me conclude by thanking all of my colleagues who have offered their comments, their draft language, and their leadership, and who have been instrumental in the modern justice reforms that we must build upon. Let me thank the tens of thousands of district residents who have peacefully taken to the streets and demanded this body take action now. I want to thank community groups like Black Lives Matter DC who have pushed and shown up and testified at every hearing for years and years. And I'd also like to thank Attorney General Carl Racine and Mayor Muriel Bowser for their feedback and support. These reforms today will make us all safer. Crime survivors, justice-involved people, residents who will never have to interact with police, and the police themselves, with whom I work every day as both a ward council member and a committee chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I move the declaration.
Thank you, Councilmember Allen. We have the declaration before us. We received a message from the mayor, which came in after the meeting began. And because this is a virtual meeting and it's not easy for these things to be distributed, I'm going to read the message. And this is, I'm saying this at the beginning of the discussion while we have the declaration before us. This is the message from Mayor Bowser. Thank you for your commitment and work regarding policing in the district. The murder of George Floyd and the subsequent peaceful protests that have occurred in the district and across the nation have demonstrated the need for discussion, review, and in some cases, reforms in policing. I have heard and understand the calls for police reform. However, it is important to note that the Metropolitan Police Department has, over the past 18 years, instituted many of the reforms that other jurisdictions are now starting to consider. As we move to consider policing and potential reforms, I urge the council to allow a process where these issues can receive robust public discourse, which I believe will only help to increase community buy-in on any proposed reforms. I'm especially concerned that the Comprehensive Policing and Justice Reform Emergency Amendment Act of 2020 and the proposed amendments that I have been made aware of amend laws related to issues like body-worn cameras, laws which received significant consideration and public input when they were crafted, and now would be significantly changed by emergency legislation. Moreover, during today's discussion, I would surmise that there may even be further amendments that have not been noticed and that the public has not had an opportunity to weigh in on. Allowing for community input and vetting by our residents can only serve to refine and strengthen changes to policing in the district. As I've indicated previously, I support the emergency legislation, but I ask that the council delay consideration of the temporary measure until public hearings can be held. Thank you. Is there discussion on the declaration by other members?
Mr. Chairman, can I just share one quick point of order just for my colleagues and for the public in terms of public discussion?
Sure.
Thank you. within the emergency, I just want to point out that I think almost every single item that's in there, for anybody who's been attending or watching our committee hearings over the last months and over the last couple of years, has seen robust discussion from public witnesses. A lot of these issues, none of these issues are new. A lot of them have been a subject of a large amount of conversations taking place in the committee. And of course, to the point of the larger elements of hearings, we will be introducing, obviously, because this is emergency action, a permanent piece of legislation, which will then go through public hearings where we'll have an opportunity to further get more public input and then make changes as necessary through that process. So I just want to make sure the public knows that so many of these issues, for those that have been regular followers of and participants in the Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety, are not new, have had a lot of conversation that's been going on for quite some time. And we certainly, from a permanent legislation, will make sure that there are public hearings as we consider that to continue that further discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Further discussion on the declaration. Madam Secretary, would you call the roll?
Councilmember McDuffie? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Councilmember Grasso?
Yes.
Councilmember Grasso votes yes. Councilmember McDuffie?
Yes.
Councilmember McDuffie votes yes. Chairman Mendelson?
Yes.
Chairman Mendelson votes yes. Councilmember Nadeau? Councilmember Nadeau?
Yes.
Councilmember Nadeau votes yes. Councilmember Silverman?
Yes.
Councilmember Silverman votes yes. Councilmember Todd?
Yes.
Councilmember Todd votes yes. Councilmember Robert White?
Yes.
Councilmember Robert White votes yes. Councilmember Trayon White?
Yes.
Councilmember Trayon White votes yes. Councilmember Allen?
Yes.
Councilmember Allen votes yes. Councilmember Bonds?
Yes.
Councilmember Bonds votes yes. Councilmember Che?
Yes.
Councilmember Che votes yes. Councilmember Gray?
Yes.
Councilmember Gray votes yes. Mr. Chairman, there are 12 yeses.
The declaration is approved unanimously. On the underlying bill, Bill 23-774, Councilmember Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that there are several members who have circulated amendments. So why don't I just say so moved, so then we can start working our way through those.
So the measure is before us, and I believe I'm first up with the amendments. I want to begin by thanking Councilmember Allen, Chairman Allen, for bringing this bill forward. It addresses or speaks to an enormous concern in our community about police conduct. I think that among the most notable of the provisions is in section 110 concerning training, which in the long term should make a difference in the quality of policing. There are other provisions that simply codify current general orders, which is important for us to do that, but does not in and of themselves change things. I'm pleased to co-introduce this bill with all other members, and of course we'll be voting for it. Although I do have some minor issues with some aspects, which I want to mention briefly. As I indicated to Mr. Allen yesterday, from my experience, when I chaired the Judiciary Committee, I know that with regard to the Police Complaints Board, that they have always valued having a police official as one and only one of the members. And the bill that's before us would increase the membership from 5 to 8, so that one police member's influence would be diluted if it in fact makes a difference. But the bill still would remove a police official, which based on the feedback I've gotten many times from Office of Police Complaints, is not helpful. That is, having a police official is helpful. And another example of a concern I have, but I'm not going to do anything about it today, is the prohibition on the MPD from having drones, which I think sometimes can be important. And I note that we're not prohibiting drones, possession of drones by any other individual or organization in community. So I'm hopeful that things like this will be looked at more carefully. But I'm not moving any amendments with regard to those. Instead, I have 4 amendments which were circulated yesterday. The first would prohibit the hiring of police officers with a history of misconduct. And I guess I'll be moving these one at a time. Members have the amendment. The language, specific language, says a person shall be ineligible for appointment as a sworn member of the Metropolitan Police Department if he or she was previously terminated or forced to resign for disciplinary reasons from any commission or recruit probationary position within a law enforcement agency, or previously resigned from a law enforcement agency to avoid potential or proposed or pending adverse disciplinary action or termination. I think it's an important standard, which is why I'm moving this.
Mr. Chairman, I'll certainly accept that as friendly unless there's an objection.
Is there objection from any member? Madam Secretary, I don't see or hear any objections.
I do not see any objections, but Councilmember White has raised his hand. I'm not sure if this is in relation to this particular amendment or the bill itself.
All right, hearing no objection, then amendment number 1 is accepted. I'm going to move amendment number 2, which is amending the law to make clear that all matters pertaining to discipline cannot be negotiated.
Hello.
Okay. Does somebody need to mute? I can't see that somebody wants to be recognized. The amendment number 2, which was circulated yesterday, would add a provision in the law that says all matters pertaining to the discipline of sworn law enforcement personnel shall be retained by management and not be negotiable. And that this subsection shall be applicable to any collective bargaining agreements entered into after September 20th, 2020, which is the end of the current contract. I want to note that the CMPA currently has a provision that says that discipline cannot be negotiated. This amendment is intended to be broader, to speak to, among other things, the disciplinary process. Because for a long time, that language in the current law about discipline has been there while there still is a process that it has been negotiated. So this, I think this is arguably one of the most important provisions that we have before us, because it will enable quicker and I'll say quicker and more effective discipline where it's needed. So I move the amendment. Is there discussion? I do not see any discussion. I'll treat this as without objection as well. If there's no objection, this amendment will be accepted. Madam Secretary, do you see any objection?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
What was that?
I was just confirming I accept it as friendly if there's no objection.
Thank you. So the measure is accepted without objection. The third amendment that I circulated concerns use of deadly force by a police officer. A similar provision, a bit more extensive, is in the bill as circulated last night. And so therefore I am not moving amendment number 3. And amendment number 4, which I circulated, I'm going to need some help from our budget director, would improve the executive director of the Office of Police Complaints access to complaint information held by MPD. This language is taken from bills introduced. The bill says 20 years ago, it's actually 10 years ago, to which at that time MPD has strenuously objected. This clarification makes it clear that the OPC director who decides if the information is necessary, not the chief of police. So I want to ask our budget director, the fiscal impact statement with regard to this says that there may be a fiscal impact. That's not the same as there is a fiscal impact. I want to note that I have a fiscal impact statement on this language from 10 years ago, in which the CFO cited that with regard to the reasons that have now been given to the budget office with regard to changing the computer process was not cited as a cost 10 years ago. And instead, I mean, this just speaks to the whole problem with fiscal impact statements. Ms. Budoff, are you fiscal impact statement from long ago?
Yes, we did see that. I mean, unfortunately, you know, that fiscal impact statement was from 10 years ago. We contacted the Metropolitan Police Department and spoke with others. And there just was not enough time to determine what the cost of this amendment would be. The Metropolitan Police Department did indicate that there would be a cost. We were not able to quantify it given the time that we had. Therefore, that is why the conclusion of the fiscal impact statement says that the actual cost could not be quantified in time for the legislative meeting. It is entirely possible that we will be able to quantify them over the next 2 weeks. And if there is not a cost, this could be amended to the temporary, or if there is a cost, that could be funded through the budget that is currently before us. But out of all of the amendments we received, this was the one that we were not able to conclusively determine.
Well, my question is not so much what is the cost, but whether in fact there is a cost. And let me say a little bit more. The Metropolitan Police Department has always objected to this proposal, which as I mentioned in legislation about 10 years ago. I believe it was introduced in several council periods. In the last council period it was introduced, it was co-introduced by myself, Councilmember Chain, then Councilmember Bowser. MPD strenuously objected to it. And as we all know, sometimes the way that the executive branch or an agency can thwart legislation is by saying that there's a fiscal impact. So 10 years ago, what they said is that they would have to hire somebody to redact complaints. And that was the only fiscal impact that was identified. And what my office has been told by the Office of Police Complaints is that it does get information from MPD and it's not redacted. So that was a bogus argument back then, but it supported MPD's efforts to object to and block the bill. So today, instead of talking about redacting, they're bringing up something they didn't bring up 10 years ago, which is namely that they'll have to redo their computer system, which doesn't make sense to me since Office of Police Complaints does get most of this complaint information. They just don't have unfettered access. So I can't help but question whether this is a real cost. And the reason why I'm raising this here is because, first of all, I think it's good for the independent Office of Police Complaints to have unfettered access. And second, because the fiscal impact from the budget office says this amendment may have, doesn't say will have, an adverse impact. If it's your recommendation that this be further looked at and that it could be added to the temporary, and General Counsel's okay with adding it to the temporary, and Councilmember Allen's okay with waiting until then, I will withdraw this. Mr. Allen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think in light of what we've heard from the budget office, and I respect the fact you've got a FIS from a decade ago, I think certainly in the next couple of weeks, we could have those conversations and further that to be able to come back either at the reading on the temporary, or I think as Ms. Budoff suggested, perhaps even within the BSA, within the budget, could be one other vehicle. So I'm happy to work with you on that in the weeks to come.
Thank you. I'm more interested in the temporary. Madam General Counsel, do you see an issue with this being added to the temporary if we work out the fiscal impact?
No, Mr. Chairman.
All right, then I will not move it at this time. Councilmember Grasso has amendments, so I will recognize him next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This morning, I'm moving several amendments to this legislation that I believe will start the long overdue process of demilitarizing our police. I greatly appreciate Councilmember Allen's quick work on this bill. Last week was another painful moment for our nation. our city, and particularly Black Americans, as killings further laid bare the continued devaluation of Black lives throughout the United States. These events touched off more than 10 days of largely peaceful protests in the District of Columbia and cities across the world. Combined with the concurrent primary election, last week was a whirlwind for all of us, but particularly for the Judiciary Committee. Putting together a proposal amidst all of that must have been incredibly difficult. My concern, though, is that this bill does not go far enough to fundamentally alter the dynamics of policing in the District of Columbia. Last week, we were all furious and unnerved by the occupation of the District of Columbia with the non-consensual deployment of federal troops and unmarked officers on our city streets. But for many residents, every day feels like an occupation because of how the police operate in our communities. Even as there are individual officers that are indeed upstanding and seek to help, the system and structure of policing in our city and our country is one of violence and racism, and the moment demands bold action to pare that back. That must include demilitarization and reducing the money we spend on MPD. I had asked for limits on the weapons that are used against protesters to be part of the bill before us, but I was not successful in getting them included. The amendments that I'm about to offer are all directly responsive to the outpouring of community demands for fundamental changes to the police. I have received, as all of us have, thousands of emails from District of Columbia residents in just the past few days, asking that we reduce police budgets, demands for demilitarizing the police, and changing policing practices. These amendments, along with provisions already in the underlying emergency bill, go directly to those demands. What we cannot do with this emergency is change the budget. The mayor's proposed budget for fiscal year 2021 is before the council right now, and that is indeed the vehicle for making budgetary changes. I'm committed to making those changes in the budget process and to working with my colleagues to pass them, those changes that can divert funding from police in favor of investing in our community's safety through greater economic security and stronger social services. So my first amendment today, which was circulated yesterday, would prohibit the use of chemical weapons such as tear gas and pepper spray against protesters, based largely on language that was already circulated in Councilmember Nadeau's permanent legislation. Just yesterday, we received a letter from the DC Association of Psychologists in support of this approach. This is an especially timely amendment. Tear gas, for example, causes increased coughing, chest tightness, and risk for chronic bronchitis, precisely the kind of respiratory ailments we should minimize during this COVID-19 pandemic. Other jurisdictions have taken similar action or are considering doing so, including Seattle, Portland, and indeed Pittsburgh. We should take this action as well today, and I ask for my colleagues' support. This is the First Amendment, Mr. Chairman, so moved.
We have the amendment before us. I'll recognize the
Mr. Chairman.
committee first, Mr. Allen.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Grosso. And, I certainly will associate myself with your words around how much all of us have been deeply impacted by what we saw and how outraged we have been around what took place for peaceful First Amendment assembly and protest. And if anybody hasn't had a chance to look at the expose that I think the Washington Post put together last night, detailing in great detail the what I think is just a full-out assault on DC residents by these federal entities at Lafayette, just incredibly just unacceptable. What I wanted to do is ask a couple of questions, if I could, Mr. Grosso, to make sure I understand some of the intent behind this, because one of the reasons that I think it might be necessary that we follow the process where we have Councilmember Nadeau's legislation to go through a full vetting. Some of the questions I just don't know the answers to, which is some of the reasons why we weren't able to include it thus far. Within this amendment, one of the pieces, for example, that I just don't know the answer to, even though I think you and I both share the same goal, is understanding what the impact could potentially be for the mayor in terms of entering into an agreement with a law enforcement agency unless it prohibits using the less than lethal projectile. So for example, within the district, so as the Judiciary and Public Safety Chair, I know that we spend a lot of time working with across the entire DMV region, a lot of partners, both with mutual aid agreements that we have for assistance when we need it. And that includes both police, but fire and EMS and others. But we also have a lot of agreements where we are working, for example, around as the nation's capital on homeland security efforts, where we've got to have agreements in place where we work with a lot of partners that are not going to share the same vision that I think you and I have in terms of their law enforcement. Or, for example, with the National Guard, as unhappy as I am about seeing the actions that we saw from the National Guard, we also know that as we've seen with hurricane responses and others, where we have an established relationship with the National Guard that plays humanitarian roles. And so would a restriction on entering into an agreement, I know this is not your intent, but would it unintentionally create a barrier to those? And for me, that's a little bit why I feel like we needed a little more time so that we can try to flesh out what the potential impact could be on this. And so that was my concern. Wanted to ask you if you could talk about, in terms of your own discussions, how would this affect our existing agreements that already are in place across the region for those other non-First Amendment purposes that that we do have a very healthy relationship and sometimes really have a mutual reliance upon as the nation's capital as well.
Yes, so thank you, Councilmember Allen. You know, the fact is that this is very limited in its approach to just addressing First Amendment assembly. So it's exactly what it is for this emergency period while you're working on Councilmember Nadeau's bill. We are saying that while people are protesting, which they continue to do, that they cannot use the chemical weapons that have indeed been outlawed across the world already on those peaceful assembly protests. So they just are for First Amendment assembly, so it wouldn't have any impact on other arrangements that you already have in place. Although I don't think they should be used in any circumstance. We did limit this amendment for this emergency period because demonstrations are still taking place in DC, and I'm very worried that you will see them resort again to using these types of irritants to disperse the crowds, which is just inappropriate.
Thank you. Just a follow-up on this. So I believe there's still a section in this amendment, though, that speaks to prohibiting the mayor from entering into an agreement with other law enforcement agencies and entities. And I guess if I'm zeroing in on something, that's an area of my concern, because again, there are going to be times when we have an agreement or a mutual aid agreement with other law enforcement partners for non-First Amendment assembly purposes that we may need. You know, we'll be heading into hurricane season, and certainly the district has been impacted by hurricanes before. It's just one example, but there may be other areas where we need that. And I want to be careful that we don't unintentionally preclude the ability for us to have those relationships with those other law enforcement entities when there are the appropriate times that we need that.
Well, again, I mean, even in that section.
Mr. Grasso, before you respond, let me interject two things. One is the language, Mr. Allen, that you just noted, that would prohibit or rather require that any agreement by the mayor has to include certain restrictions. That language appears in your amendment number 2 as well. And in this amendment, that language speaks to non-lethal, less than lethal projectiles, whereas the rest of this amendment number 1 speaks to chemical agents, which makes me think that this might have been a cut and paste matter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regardless, it may need to be a technical amendment there to get the wording right, because in the beginning of that second paragraph, I'm still referring to chemical irritants to disperse a First Amendment assembly. But what we're doing here is trying to limit it, like I said, to just the First Amendment assemblies here. So it's not trying to expand it to other mutual aid agreements that you're talking about, response to a hurricane, although I'm not sure why you would use a chemical irritant in that regard. I do think this is limited to just the First Amendment rights. That what we're basically saying is don't use these chemicals, don't enter into agreements with other organizations that can use these chemicals on the District of Columbia. Now, you can't prevent it if it's the federal government imposing it like they have, but you can, I think, at least take a stand on our side in the District of Columbia to not use and not support the use of these chemical irritants on DC residents as they are assembling. This is just for protests. This is not in other areas, although again, as I said, I would support that too.
Right. Now I hear you. What I guess, as I had read some language, it would prohibit the mayor from entering into an agreement with a law enforcement agency unless that law enforcement agency prohibits the agency from using less than lethal projectiles. So I don't want to see those federal entities or other jurisdictional issues use them as well. We obviously can't control what they do. And so that's the rub for me.
No, Councilmember Allen, you're not finishing the whole sentence. Shall prohibit the agency from using less than, this is where chemical irritants should be put in there, to disperse a First Amendment assembly on property outside the agency's jurisdiction. So it's when they come in here from a different jurisdiction, they're not allowed to use chemical irritants to support us or to disperse these folks when they're in a mutual aid agreement. That's all I'm saying. And this is,
we don't disagree on that's what we want, but we obviously can't, we are unable to by law direct a federal agency as much as I want to.
I'm just saying the mayor can't enter into an agreement with them if they're going to use those chemical irritants. Now, can we stop them from doing it if they come in here under the authority of the president? Obviously not. But can we at least say that the mayor's not allowed to enter into an agreement with them to actually allow them to use these chemical irritants? I think we can do that. And in fact, I think we should do that. This is about the people of the District of Columbia protesting peacefully, getting, sprayed with these pepper sprays. And I think it's highly inappropriate and dangerous. So, I hear
we both agree on that. We both agree on that. What we're trying to, and this is why I think that going through a hearing to be able to report out the specific language on this could be helpful, is that if we're prohibiting the mayor from entering into agreement with a law enforcement entity when we have, be it Homeland Security partnerships and tabletop exercises, be it other types of recovery relief efforts that take place, other mutual aid. My concern is, from the standpoint of being the chair of the committee, is I don't want to unintentionally create a barrier to having an agreement with those partner agencies. You and I are in lockstep in terms of what we do not want to see take place during a First Amendment assembly. So I want to be very clear. There's no question around that. The issue I have and the concern I have is around making sure that there's not an unintended consequence related to other aspects of where we have these agreements that are in place. And that's the part of my question and concern.
I think I understand, and I appreciate that, Councilmember Allen. And if it would make you feel more comfortable, perhaps we could take out the second sentence of subsection 2, so that there wouldn't be any confusion there. I just didn't see an issue with it, but if that would make it easier for you to accept, then we can do that, which would remove the section that it sounds like you're most concerned about there being confusion with.
Okay, could you, I appreciate that. Could you just tell me when you say sentence 2, just so that we have clarity on that?
So basically it would just say that the section B1, well, here it is here. B1 just says chemical irritants shall not be used by MPD, period. And then we would do B2, we would say the mayor shall request any federal law enforcement agency operating to refrain from the use of chemical irritants to disperse a First Amendment assembly. And then we would strike B. So B would not be in this emergency, and we would debate that through the permanent process that you're already working on.
Okay, so just to be clear, so we would strike B to B.
Right.
Okay. I think I think that, again, as we've tried to kind of outline, that to me is the piece where we have some potential unintended consequences that I don't think we're trying to create. My comfort level goes up if we can strike that, because then we don't have a possible unintended consequence, and then we have the ability to continue exploring this through a hearing on permanent legislation.
I'm fine with that. If that can get us to move forward here, I appreciate the confusion that it's created, and I'm happy to strike it for now. Mr. Chairman, is that clear?
I'm following. I don't know if everybody else is. Let me ask if there are questions or debate from others, and then I'll restate where we are with the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there questions or comments from other members? All right, so we have the amendment before us, and what the amendment is, what Mr. Grasso circulated. And it defines chemical irritant. It prohibits chemical irritants from being used by MPD to disperse a First Amendment assembly, and requires the mayor to request any federal law enforcement agency refrain from the use of chemical irritants to disperse a First Amendment assembly, and that subparagraph B, that would be subsection B1, no, B2B is not included in the amendment. If that is clear with everybody, I will go the not without objection route. So if there's no objection, this amendment will be accepted. Madam Secretary, do you agree that we're not seeing any objection?
No objection, Mr. Chairman.
All right, so it's accepted without objection as amended. Mr. Grasso?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have another amendment to propose. Councilmember Allen included in the final version of the bill before us today a very important provision that would limit the purchase of military equipment by MPD. That is, as I noted, incredibly important. But the chemical weapons we just voted on and the weapons that are the subject of this amendment are not always considered military equipment, even though they can cause grave harm or even death. This amendment will prohibit the use of riot gear unless there is an immediate risk of bodily injury to officers, and would prohibit the use of riot gear to disperse the First Amendment protest. Just last week, we saw how the deployment of riot gear can escalate rather than de-escalate a situation. And we saw how riot shields can be used as weapons against people. This amendment would further prohibit the use of so-called less lethal projectiles against protesters, such as rubber bullets and stun guns. So, stun grenades. These projectiles can actually kill or seriously harm our residents. According to one medical journal, rubber bullets kill 3% of people that they strike, while 15% of people that are struck suffer serious injuries, such as a loss of an eye or even a hand. These military-style weapons simply should not be used on our streets. The people are demanding that we reduce the militarization and use of force by the police. This amendment is another step in that direction. I ask my colleagues to support this. So moved, Mr. Chairman. And I'll preempt Councilmember Allen. I will take out that same section in this amendment if that makes you feel more comfortable from the beginning. So, Mr. Chairman, I assume it's B2, yeah, it's C2B. We would strike that as I move it.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Councilmember.
And I appreciate Mr. Grasso. I think you're anticipating where I was going to go, because one of my concerns would be, again, while not disagreeing with you about your overarching goal, would this potentially have an impact, for example, because I think we're talking about, this is again, number 2, the limitations on training, I believe is which amendment we're on.
No, that's number 3, Councilmember Allen.
Okay.
This is number 2. This is just the lethal projectiles and riot gear and the use of that to kind of disperse a peaceful protest.
Yeah, so similar concern again. So if we're striking that language, that increases my comfort level in terms of where we are on an emergency basis.
Further discussion on this amendment. All right, the amendment is as circulated, striking that language at the very end, that any agreement that the mayor enters into shall prohibit the agency. That is struck. If there's no objection, this amendment will be accepted. Madam Secretary, will you confirm that we're not seeing or hearing any objection?
No objections raised, Mr. Chairman.
All right, so the amendment is accepted. Mr. Grasso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is my 3rd amendment, which also addresses the militarization of police. And it does so by prohibiting MPD from training with any military or intelligent forces or personnel. It also prohibits MPD from training with an agency or facility that practices pervasive discrimination. The rise of militarization of police has happened not only through the accumulation of weaponry and gear that's more fit for war than our neighborhoods, it also is a result of the use of military tactics that are equally inappropriate. This amendment responds to the demand for demilitarizing our police that is coming from our streets right now. I ask that we all listen to them and pass this amendment immediately. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So moved.
Mr. Allen?
Thank you again. And again, appreciate it, Mr. Grasso. So on this one of the questions I had is, so frequently within the existing public safety cluster, we will have partners that include, for example, the National Guard that will be engaged in planning processes, tabletop exercises related to everything from how do we plan for and train for emergent situations like train derailment, and so how do we deploy in that, homeland security purposes, again, kind of natural disasters. And so would the intent here be that the types of training that takes place currently within our public safety agencies for those types of events, would that be prohibited here? Because it seems like by saying that we're going to say that MPD cannot participate in trainings that are military in nature or conducted by military or intelligence forces personnel, we would be potentially excluding those types of events, which again, I don't believe that's if I'm trying to take a step back to kind of some of the intent of what I believe you're trying to achieve, I don't think that that's what you're trying to do necessarily, but I wanted to ask, because I think that, again, there's a lockstep here when we talk about First Amendment assembly and the way in which we want to protect people's right to be able to protest and speak. These again hits these areas where I think there could be a potential unintended consequences, the way that I'll say it right now, in terms of some of the other roles and relationships that we have. And so if I could ask you, is your intent that we would prohibit that tabletop training, for example, with the National Guard when it comes to man-made natural disasters that MPD would play a role in?
Thank you, Councilmember Allen. I appreciate the question. You know, for me, the intent here is to get MPD to do and engage in the type of training that better prepares them to be involved most directly with communities that they are policing. So to better support community policing, neighborhood engagement and involvement. And when I hear about police going off to train with military personnel, that makes me very nervous that it gets them outside of their box. Now, there may be some opportunities where they have to do this to better prepare for a natural disaster or something of that nature, which I would be okay with. But I don't like this idea that they need to do some sort of military training. So it's not necessarily as much the trainings that are put on by National Guard for what you were saying. It's more about how do you get them to refocus their efforts on trainings that actually get them more accepted and involved and engaged in our communities, rather than driving around like they are now with their lights flashing on the back and, you know, putting everybody on notice that they're in the neighborhood and are, you know, going to be there to hold you accountable as soon as you step in the wrong direction. And that's my fear, is that we're too focused on that type of approach, assuming everybody's the enemy, assuming everybody is going to commit a crime, rather than policing in a way that accepts everybody is there for good reason. And so my intent is not to prohibit that kind of stuff you're talking about, which I think is legit. It's about these other more base substantial trainings that I know we're doing that I have been opposed to in the past with actual military personnel.
No, I thank you very much. And again, I think I fully understand the intent of where you're going from one type of training. My fear with this amendment is that we would be unintentionally creating a situation where the other type of training, be that for, you know, how would we respond if a train derails in the Virginia Avenue tunnel, or how we are going to have a humanitarian response. That those types of trainings, which I think has a lot of value, would be unintentionally restricted or prevented in this case. And so I without some changes to this one, again, I fully understand and agree with you on the intent on the front side of what you're talking about. I think that there's some potential risk on the backside of this. And this again is why I think with a hearing on some of the permanent legislation, we'd be able to fully get the language right. So on this one, I just have a little, I have a concern that we would create an unintentional restriction on some of the types of trainings that we do need to have, especially as the nation's capital when we're talking about either man-made or natural disasters where we have those partnerships.
I'm going to speak up and then ask if other members want to speak. I'm not going to support this amendment, and I would urge members to not support this amendment. As drafted, it's very broad in its effect. So if we're talking about training that enhances community policing, absolutely what this amendment tries to do makes sense. If we're talking about training that deals with de-escalation of tense circumstances, then absolutely this amendment might be appropriate. If we're talking about training that deals with police taking a mental health approach, recognizing that oftentimes when we see something like a person who's standing in the street brandishing a gun, that maybe there's a mental health issue, then absolutely this amendment might be appropriate. But there are other aspects of training that are important. For example, terrorism response. And we know that the district is a hotspot for potential terrorist activities. And there is all the time training that happens on an international exchange basis, which is language in this amendment that this amendment would prohibit. Training all the time on an international exchange basis with regard to terrorism. In addition, what this amendment does is it would prohibit training that would be conducted by intelligence forces. So I know, for example, that there is training that takes place with law enforcement agencies with regard to responding to terrorist threats and incidents that oftentimes involves forces, police forces or law enforcement forces in Israel. And I became aware of this because of an email that I don't know if all members received this yesterday from the Jewish Community Relations Council, and I'll read part of it. As you know, we had concerns about 2 years ago that groups that were hostile to Israel in an effort to delegitimize the Jewish state were calling for legislation that would prohibit MPD officers from training in Israel. That effort was part of a program called Deadly Exchange and was an organized effort by activists around the country to participate in the international boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against the Jewish state. These amendments would have the effect of prohibiting that kind of anti-terrorism training. And I don't think we want to go there. I think that we want, if anything, to encourage training with regard to community policing, de-escalation, mental health, and terrorism. And that if in fact there is something that we want, if we want to somewhat go in this direction, absolutely we have to do it after much broader consideration and input from many different stakeholders so that we understand what would be implicated by the prohibitions in this amendment, which I think, as written, would deter any training with, I shouldn't say any, but would deter useful and meaningful training with regard to dealing with terrorism. So that is why I'm going to oppose this amendment. Is there further discussion?
Mr. Chairman?
Let me see if there's anybody who's not spoken first. Mr. Grasso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I had a good opportunity to really think about this over the past week or so as I've spoken to many different stakeholders. And I have to say that I think this is the core of what people are asking us to do. And I think what they're saying is, look, the local police force needs to be involved in the things that matter to local neighborhoods, to be partnering with people in every single community in the District of Columbia. And then we should leave these other things to the entities that actually are assigned to take care of them, like the HCMA folks, like FEMA, like the folks like the National Guard. And that, yes, MPD should be prepared for these types of things that you're talking about, but it doesn't mean that that should be their primary purpose, nor should they be trained to do it in some other country or some other part of the world. What I would like to see first and foremost is the Metropolitan Police Department committed to the communities in my city, committed to the relationships in my city that they have a hard time building, that they have a hard time actually creating, not going off and trying to worry about those big picture things, which are very important, don't get me wrong, but we have other entities that can take care of that. First and foremost, MPD should be committed to this city, and they should be caring about the things that make our neighborhoods click. I would like to see the murder rate go down in the District of Columbia before I worry about whether the MPD should be training across the world on anti-terrorism things, frankly. And I think we haven't done a good job of that. So when I say limit MPD's training to this, I'm saying refocus them on the things that matter to the residents of the District of Columbia. Now, clearly there needs to be greater debate on this. Clearly that the chair of the committee doesn't support it, the chairman doesn't support it. But I do think that you all should take a deep look inside of yourselves and just say, hey, what do you want in your MPD? Do you want an MPD that's main focus is trainings from other countries around anti-terrorism and war and militarization of MPD? Or do you want an MPD that actually waves to you when you go down the street and knows who you are and cares about your daily lives? That's the question I ask everybody. But I will withdraw this amendment.
The amendment's withdrawn. Mr. Grasso, I believe you had a fourth amendment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do. I have one more amendment. My final amendment would place a cap on the number of sworn officers in the Metropolitan Police Department. In addition to the thousands of federal law enforcement personnel in the District of Columbia, which creates an environment of over-policing, the MPD has by far the highest number of officers per resident of any city of our size or bigger. Let me just give you the numbers. Currently, we have about 55 MPD officers per 10,000 residents. Chicago has 44 per 10,000. New York has 42 per 10,000. Baltimore has 40 per 10,000, and Boston only has 31 per 10,000. This amendment would cap the number of MPD officers at 3,500, which would actually be 50 officers per 10,000 residents, which is still among the highest of our peer cities. With this amendment, if MPD has more than 3,500 officers, which it currently does now, the agency would have to institute a hiring freeze and not replace any officers who separate until the force dips below this number. I wanted this amendment to reallocate the savings to other from these vacant positions and these positions that they're removing to violence interruption work or mental health work, both of which face millions of dollars of cuts in Mayor Bowser's budget. But we can only take that change in the budget process, not with this legislation. So I hope we can do that when the time comes. I'm going to ask my colleagues to support this amendment. And I want to make something very clear before we go down the debate. And I want to just say that this is something that I have struggled with because I have groups that are pushing me to have 0 police officers in the District of Columbia. And then I have other groups that think we should have 4,000 plus police officers in the District of Columbia. This is a very challenging debate and something that I think we all should take a close, hard look on. The fact of the matter, I am putting this cap, but I am not saying that the Committee on Judiciary or some other way that this body acts couldn't actually reduce it to less than that. We can make it as far down as 2,000, 1,000, or 0 if that's what we chose to do. I'm just saying, let's not race to the top. Let's not race to the most number of police officers in the country. Let's put a limit right now so that as we go through the budget process, we actually can find a way forward to not think that more police officers on our streets is actually going to make our cities safer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Grasso. Councilmember Allen, do you want to speak to this?
I do. I appreciate it. Thank you. I'll try to walk through a couple of areas. To some degree here, I question why we would pick 3,500. Why not 3,400, 3,300, 3,600? I think it's problematic to, within the law, place a number of what we want our force to look like. I remember a couple of years ago, there was an effort to set in law a much higher number. I believe it was 4,200, and I opposed that, but more from the standpoint of saying, I don't think within law, within statute, we should say what the force number should be, because that means that we're not using budget, policy, data, evidence to tell us what the right number is. So there's an element of this that's a little bit just on principle. I don't think you should put in law what the force size should be. I'd have another concern with this, though, is that while the initial idea of saying, let's just cut down to 3,500, and again, I'm not quite sure why we'd pick 3,500 versus some other number, it doesn't actually get to some of the underlying issues of what it is that we're seeking to change. When I hear the voices, it's not just talking about what's the number of police officers, it's about policing itself. It's about the changes we expect to see within a department and the way in which we want public safety to be carried out. And so just cutting the number doesn't change that dynamic at all. It just reduces the number. And I think we should be trying to make the change that we really want around what it is we mean when we talk about public safety and our expectations of Metropolitan Police Department. And then there's a third aspect to this, which does get at the budget issues. Another strong chorus that I think we are all hearing is about how do we make tough decisions around a budget with MPD and find ways to make cuts and redirect those dollars into things like violence prevention, into housing, into mental and behavioral health, into education, into so many different places. And if we place a cut now through an emergency legislation and not through the budget, what it means that we as policymakers will have already agreed to what the cut is, which then means when we go through the budget process, we have a harder time being able to then take those dollars that may come from reducing a force to 3,500 or something else, and then being able to use those in terms of redirecting it to the avenues that we believe are the right places to be investing. So I understand, again, as I hope is kind of sounding like a consistent theme of, I understand where I think my colleague is coming from in terms of the goals trying to be achieved, but I don't believe that this is the right way to be able to make this. I would ask my colleague if he'd consider withdrawing this. And if he doesn't, then I would ask my colleagues to not support this and to understand that even later today, we'll be holding our budget hearing with MPD. And in the next couple of weeks, we'll be going through MPD's budget before we come to a committee markup, where I believe we can then make decisions around where it is that we want to be able to make cuts, and then where it is that we want to be able to reinvest those funds into the communities that we're hearing so loudly from, and the communities that we know we need to completely and radically rethink the way in which we deliver public safety. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Allen. Further discussion?
Mr. Chairman?
Councilmember Che.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Councilmember Grasso, for putting together these amendments. And I think what you're hearing from the chair of the Judiciary Committee is something that relates to many of the things that we're doing today on an emergency basis. And that is, we support the goals. I think we are unanimous in our objectives. But the question is how best to do it, where there are, in some instances, either, as with the earlier amendment, byproduct effects that we hadn't anticipated, or with this particular amendment, getting to a place where we want to go may take some more thoughtful process, like a hearing process and the ordinary legislative process. So I don't think, and if the public is paying attention to anything that we're doing, I don't think that there's any disagreement among any of us about our objectives. But the question is, how shall we make the best responses that we can make? And shouldn't we put it in the process that usually would involve a hearing? And Councilmember Allen pointed to the budget hearing that's coming up. It would be so much better if we could do it in that more comprehensive and considered way, so that I would join with the chair of the Judiciary Committee and ask that we withdraw this. We may get to the very spot, but withdraw it for now in an emergency bill and give us time to really work through many of the things that we have to consider, and whether it's even appropriate to specify a number as such. In any case, so I would ask, as the chairman of the Judiciary Committee did ask Councilmember Grasso, with all due respect, because I'm very grateful for what you've put together, if you could withdraw this at this time.
Is there further discussion from council members?
Mr. Chairman.
Council member, it sounded like Councilmember Robert White.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand the concern Councilmember Grasso is raising here, and I'm glad he's raising this. So my concern is that right now, I think we have developed, not just locally, but nationally, a crutch, so that whenever we have to address public safety, we say, here's more police. What that results in for Black people is getting pulled over for a traffic violation and being surrounded by 4 and 5 police cars. Young Black boys being chased from playgrounds by armed police officers. Young Black kids being questioned by droves of police officers. And so I think that we have had a lot less thought about strategically how we make ourselves safer while also protecting people of color and protecting their dignity and rights, because we have this crutch of just expanding our police force. And my concern, I'm okay with having this conversation in a more thorough way. My concern is that we won't do that, or that we won't find an intersection where we will say, you know what, we do have too many police officers, and the result is that we're not using them efficiently, effectively, or fairly. If Councilmember Allen, you can help give me some assurance that this is a place that we can reach, then I can consider whether we should maybe vote on this at a later date. But I do have to say, I am worried that I don't see another realistic path to where Councilmember Grasso is trying to go here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, can I reply?
I think I'd like to see if there's further discussion before I recognize you, Mr. Allen.
Okay. Councilor White asked me a direct question, so I was just trying to make sure I could reply to him.
Well, don't forget his question. Other members, anybody else wish to speak? Mr. Allen.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I certainly appreciate Councilmember White's comments as well. We have a hearing, of course, that would be taking place right now. Of course, our legislative meeting is going to run a little bit long, but we have a hearing today over the next several hours where we're going to be focusing in on the MPD budget, where directly to Mr. White's comments, we will be asking the tough questions around how we make significant change, as well as how we look at what is that right number, but not just what is the right number, because I don't want to get fixated or focused on just what a number is. It's really, the question is much bigger than that. The question is much more transformational than that. I invite everybody to be a part of that hearing that we're going to have. And you know, in a couple of weeks, we'll have our committee markup. And I look to my committee members, Councilmember Che, Councilmember Gray, Councilmember Bonds, as we will have put before us, and I will put before you, a budget that will make big decisions. And being able to get a committee budget out of committee that makes some of the type of transformational changes that we're talking about, that I believe we want to see. It will require my fellow committee members to be able to make tough decisions on a budget. And I will work with you to do that. And to my non-committee members, then once we pull that budget up and move it to the full council, we'll have to do that. I'll note this time a year ago, when proposed and moved through, and I appreciate my colleagues' support, an incredibly modest change to MPD, where we essentially shaved off just shy of $2 million from vacant positions that went unfilled year after year to be able to redirect that into violence prevention. It was as if we had completely shocked the Metropolitan Police Department system to be able to try to find some funding that was being unspent and left in vacancies to be able to redirect towards public safety by investing in the things that we as a council have worked so hard to focus on, and that is our community-based violence prevention. It was battles in the media, on social media. You remember the official police department Twitter handle was attacking this, and I know it made some of my colleagues anxious to see that, but I'm proud that we hung together. That was a fairly modest action that we took last year. I think that we are in a place where this body is able to make more significant, more transformational type of changes that I think speak directly to what I've heard Mr. White talk about. I think it's exactly what I've heard my other colleagues talk about. Councilor McDuffie has been a leader in this space, talking about how we are focused on our racial equity across the entire budget. Councilmember Robert White, you've talked about how this also has to be beyond just judiciary and public safety. Councilmember Trayon White, you've spoken eloquently about how we have to do so much more when it comes to our community investments in Ward 8. And to all my colleagues, I know that this is a high priority for us to focus on. And I think we have an opportunity in front of us to do it. You've got my commitment to work with you all to do that. But I think creating and setting just a hard number is not the right approach to achieve the type of transformational change that we're trying to create through this. And we're going to be going through a budget here in just a couple of weeks. And so I look forward to having everybody work with us, and I look forward to the partnership we'll have.
Mr. Chairman.
Councilmember Che, and then Mr. Grasso.
Thank you very much. You know, I want to build on something that Councilmember White did say. and to add to Councilmember Allen, which is to say, I want everyone to understand that this emergency bill is not the end of this conversation. Our over-reliance on police to address the consequences of our lack of adequate investment in education and housing and employment, behavioral health, this it cannot be the end of the conversation. And we will have even, I hope, Councilmember Allen, a further hearing wholly apart from the budget, because I have, and I'm sure others have, many more ideas about what we should be doing. And we need to do that, and we need to do that through the Judiciary Committee. So I'd like a commitment that we will have a hearing directed to that, and through hearings in other committees that directly bear upon these matters. So we have to shift our thinking fundamentally. And so when Councilmember White asks for some assurances that we will be poised to do that and will set into practice procedures so that we can do that, I want to add my thought to that as well. And I hope that, you know, we can commitment from Councilmember Allen, but all committee chairs about how we can more fundamentally look at the causes of violence in our society and where we have not invested nearly enough in all of these areas that require us to pay attention to social ills. So again, I do want to make sure everybody understands this is not at all or even close to the end of the conversation.
Thank you, Councilmember Shea. Councilmember Grasso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to start by just saying how much I appreciate the discussion that we've been able to have here, although fairly limited in its scope. The reality is that I wouldn't move this forward today if I didn't strongly believe that the approach we've taken historically in the city has been wrong. I have been working here now since 2001. I started my job in January of 2001. And all I've ever heard across that entire time period has been, how do we have more police? How do more police will solve the problem? And I can tell you that I'm tired of that. And I think you're right, Councilmember Allen. A fixation on the number is exactly what we've done historically in this city. And the number, though, unfortunately, has been, how do we make it bigger rather than how do we make it better and smaller and more engaged with our community? So I am feeling that the community is asking us to take action. I am worried, like Councilmember Robert White has been noting, that we will lose momentum, that we will not see this through, that we will forget, that we will come up upon summer recess, and then this won't be brought up again. And frankly, that is why I've been so urgent about moving these forward today. That is why I think we should do it on an emergency basis today. But out of respect for you, Councilmember Allen, I asked you, if we come up with a permanent bill in the next week or so and get it introduced, will you commit to having a hearing on this particular issue before recess kicks in?
Mr. Chair.
I think that question was directed to you, Mr. Allen.
Yes, I'm just making sure, since we always flow through you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, and to my colleagues, I appreciate the calls for will we have a conversation. I also want to remind my colleagues, we've been having hearings on these issues for quite some time, and I'm frequently the only council member sitting in these hearings.
I'd like to recall my time.
To make sure that my colleagues will come to these when we hold hearings on.
I simply asked a question on whether or not you would hold a hearing on the reduction of MPD's force in the District of Columbia, which is what the protesters are calling for. They want.
What are you doing in an hour, Mr. Grasso? We have a hearing on the MPD budget to go over these numbers later today.
You're saying, Councilmember Allen, that this is too quick, or that this is not a good idea to do 30, to do the number at that number. What I'm asking is, how do we have a broader discussion on this topic? Of course, the budget.
What are you doing later today? We have a hearing on MPD's budget on force numbers today.
So you won't hold a hearing?
I'm going to ask.
Are you coming to the hearing today? We have one on MPD to focus.
Not on this issue.
Mr. Grasso.
I'm asking him a simple question.
I know you are, and you've gotten the answer. Councilmember Bonds, did you want to be recognized?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, thank you. I just had a question of Mr. Grasso. Is the intent of this amendment to impact the current budget? Is that primarily one of the goals here?
Thank you, Councilmember Bonds. It's actually not entirely that. That is not my entire goal here. My entire goal here is to reimagine the Metropolitan Police Department's role in the District of Columbia. That is why I have offered all these amendments to demilitarize them. And that is why I'm saying that we do not need a force that outnumbers any other jurisdiction like ours in its comparison in ratios to the residents. So no, I'm not saying that. I do believe that Councilmember Allen and the Judiciary Committee can have that role to play in the budget process, and I support that. But in the meantime, in our statutes right now, there is a section that requires that there be a minimum number of police, no less than 3,000. So, you know, I am a little bit frustrated here because I think we're just looking at this from the wrong perspective. We're saying there should be no less than, I'm saying there should be no more than. Pick a number. I think fine is 3,500 was a reasonable number, but I think there is a clear policy question there that is important for us to debate. And that's why I was asking for an independent hearing on that question. That's all I was doing. Thank you, Councilmember Bonds.
Thank you very much for your response. And I think I have to agree with you that an independent hearing on this matter is warranted. We are now talking about what's in the statute. And whenever we talk about that, I've always heard from those that are on the council now and otherwise, that this is a very serious matter. And so the citizens, the persons who are in the District of Columbia, our residents, our businesses need to weigh in whenever we have this discussion. They need to be aware of what the data shows us, how we're at the top of the heap. Is that something that we want to be a signature about the District of Columbia? But I tend to agree that having a separate hearing on this matter before we take action may be the right course at this point, just from the limited dialogue that I've heard. So I just want to be clear as to what you're asking me to support or not support. So thank you very much.
Councilmember Silverman.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So Councilmember Grasso, you said something at the beginning of your remarks that there are many people calling for the number to be 0. And I guess for me, this is about how we shift our resources to truly make us safer. So the number does matter because we don't have infinite resources. So for example, if we're going to pay for 500 behavioral health specialists, if we set the number at 3,500 sworn officers, I think we know that MPD will argue for 3,500 sworn officers, and it might make it more difficult for us to find funding for that 500 behavioral health specialists. I guess what I'm saying here, Councilmember Grasso, is I'm in agreement with you. But we know MPD will probably go to whatever highest level we set in the statute. And maybe that number should be 1,500, 2,000, 2,500. So I guess I want to communicate to you that I'm in agreement with you, but I don't want to set a number right now because I'm concerned that if we do, and to me, the defund police effort is about shifting resources to effective strategies to make us safer and make Black residents safer. And so maybe the number should even be lower, and I'm afraid we're going to hem ourselves in. So, I'm not sure. I've struggled to understand what we're debating in terms of this hearing. I think it sounds like we all agree on the hearing. It's just a matter of timing. And I hope we can get to a place, because this is an important conversation about we're spending our taxpayer dollars. I think what I hear from our residents and what I read in the 4,000, probably now 5,000 emails I've gotten is that traditional, as you say it, and I agree with you, military style policing isn't effective. And in fact, it's harmful to Black and Latino residents in our city. We need to make this shift. And I think setting the number right now hems us in so that we can't do the shifting we need to really fund the trust and community-based efforts that we need to go toward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Let me see if there's anybody else who hasn't spoken. And this would be, I think, a third round for you, Mr. Grasso. Is there anybody else who wishes to be recognized? Mr. Grasso?
I don't want to jump in. I think I saw Councilmember Gray wanting to speak, Mr. Chairman. He just didn't have his mute off. Is that true, Councilmember Gray?
Are you just telling me, Mr. Grasso, to recognize Mr. Gray, or did you want
I just don't know. It looked like he was trying to get his microphone to work.
I was, Mr. Grasso. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Let me make sure I'm unmuted, okay?
You're unmuted.
All right, thank you very much. I just want to understand the rationale for the number, 3,500 or whatever number is now on the table. I think it's been an excellent, robust discussion up to this point. But if Mr. Grasso could speak to what he considers to be the rationale underlying the numbers, I would appreciate that, because I represent a ward where you're constantly, we need more police officers. The number of police officers that are assigned, they're always being detailed somewhere else. So what is the rationale that leads you to, Mr. Grasso, the number that you've chosen? Because I think there are some good arguments that have been made about having further discussion about whether there should be a number or not. And if there should be a number, what is the rationale for that?
Well, thank you, council member. You know, I appreciate your question. And in fact, this was a reduction in force that I thought we could probably get the support for during this emergency bill process. The reality is that, you know, I support us going down to zero and starting from scratch like they did in Camden, New Jersey. But I didn't think that I would get very far in the debate to actually have that conversation. So I think what this does is it gets us into the discussion, gets us into the debate, and frankly, is a reduction in force that is possible, right? Because of the vacancies and because of the, you know, the reality that they'll have people retiring or moving and you just wouldn't rehire them. But, you know, frankly, I'm open to other numbers. And, you know, I also feel, you know, very compelled now to withdraw this because of the discussion that we've had has been so robust. And the fact is that we do need to come up with a better number. I'm a little frustrated that people haven't recognized that there is actually a minimum set in the statute already, and no one's ever really focused on that. But, you know, the reality is that I don't think there should be a minimum. I think it should be as low as we can get it. And, you know, Councilmember Gray, though, I'll give the time back to you. I think that answers your question for now.
It does. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Councilmember Nadeau wishes to be recognized.
Let me just check. Mr. Gray, were you done?
I am. Thank you.
Councilmember Nadeau?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Councilmember Grasso, for raising this really important issue. I certainly understand the intent behind this, and I think it is responsive to what we've been hearing from constituents over the past several weeks in terms of how we approach community engagement and crime reduction. I'll just say that I think my concern is purely, you know, about what we should be putting into statute and what we shouldn't be. I really would like to work together with my colleagues on budget reduction that would lead to the same results, and absolutely think we should look at the statutory minimum. But I'd love to do it in a way where we get to where we feel confident that we've gotten to the right number, which, as you've said, may end up being lower even than what you've suggested today. So I just want to lend my voice to support examining all of these things. I look forward to joining the budget hearing this afternoon. I think this is a really important time for us to be talking to MPD about the swelled ranks that they have. And having already reviewed the police chief's testimony, it seems that they feel pretty justified in, you know, the number of officers that they've employed. So I think we definitely need to have a robust conversation in that hearing today to really push back on the ways that we use police in the District of Columbia. I happened to have a chance meeting this morning with an officer in Ward 1 whose job is actually behavioral health work. But he wears a uniform and he carries a gun. And I guess the question for me is, why does that need to be part of what MPD does? Why isn't that, more robustly funding the Department of Behavioral Health, like we discussed last week on Friday with Director Bazran? So, I think these are the right questions to be asking. So I really look forward to continuing the conversation later today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Nadeau.
Mr.
Chairman.
Mendelson.
Mr. Allen, you want to be recognized, and then we'll proceed to a vote.
If I can, for just one last comment, it sounds like my colleague might be about to withdraw this. So I just want to add one quick comment if I can, and kind of bring it back to what I started with, which is I think that there is a growing consensus as well as a growing sense of courage that we can make changes to the police department budget. I think that's a good thing. And when I talked at the very beginning or to this conversation, I don't know if 3,500 is the right number because I don't know if 3,400 is the right number or 3,300 is the right number. That's why we would go through the budget hearing that we have later today to look through those numbers. Those are the right questions to ask, though, undoubtedly. I also, though, know that when we talk about the change that's needed, it isn't just simply about what the number is. There's a lot of change that has to take place. We have been talking about transformational change, and that's going to be more than just picking a number. And I think that's a big part of our entire conversation. And again, I'll come back to the third piece, which is a very loud and consistent voice that I think is one that is shared, it sounds like, by the large majority of people here, which is we want to be taking resources and putting them into the places where we think they can make the biggest difference to improve people's lives, to improve communities, and to improve public safety in real ways. And if we cap a number today, in 2 weeks from now, we will then be voting on a budget. Then one of my concerns is that we will have just taken an action that will now limit our ability to actually redirect resources because we have placed a cap in effect 2 weeks prior to when we'd be looking to do it within a budget context. The budget is the right place to do this because that allows us the opportunity to make some tough decisions and be able to make some smart decisions about where to put our resources. So I want to end with kind of where I started, and I appreciate the conversation, and it's one that is ongoing. And I'm glad to hear so many voices that want to be a part of it. So thank you very much, and I'll yield my time back to Mr. Grasso.
Thank you, Councilmember Allen. I appreciate your consideration and your thoughts on this, and certainly would support as I noted, a lower number than 3,500. And in fact, that's why I did a cap, right? So that you in the budget process could lower it as much as you wanted and take as much money as you wanted away from it. I didn't do a minimum for a reason. But with that said, I want to note just how grateful I am to all of the organizations, the organizers, the marchers, the protesters that are out on the streets, that are emailing us and who have helped to transform the conversation in the city as well as throughout this entire country, to make it a conversation about racism, to make it a conversation about white supremacy, about criminalization and incarceration in our country, and is asking for us to make a change. I'll note that I was also going to offer an amendment today that would have banned stop and frisk in the District of Columbia, but I was asked to hold off on that until we developed it a little further. I will be preparing emergency legislation for the next session, so if any of my colleagues would like to join me in doing that and prohibiting stop and frisk and jump outs in the District of Columbia, I'd be happy to join you with you that in the next session. With that, in hesitance, but in great respect for my colleague, Councilmember Allen, I will withdraw this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The measure is withdrawn. According to the agenda, Councilmember Trayon White has amendments. I'll recognize Mr. White.
Thank you, Chairman. First, I want to start off by thanking Councilmember Allen for his leadership during this time and offering the Comprehensive Police and Justice Reform Amendment Act of 2020. I think it's timely. I think we have to go even further. Being a Black man in America, I know firsthand how one can be mistreated by law enforcement. As you or my colleagues know, since I've been on the council, I've been talking about this for a very long time, more specifically the DC Department, DC Metropolitan Police Department. I was one, a victim of being attacked by the police, hospitalized on 2 separate occasions. So I totally get it. And so my first, in DC, I do want to list a few names. It makes me think of the names like Jeffrey Price, Marquise Austin, Raphael Briscoe, Alonzo Smith, and so many more. But these are people who have been victims of discrepanary cases, victims of homicide at the hands of the police department and or special police that's still being talked about and controversial in the community. I do want to note that we have an opportunity to change this, not just by, I've seen a gesture with the Black Lives Matter in the street, which is good. It's very beautiful. It's a good gesture. But I think that we as legislators have an opportunity to do firsthand something about how we, our laws of the land in the District of Columbia. And I know for a fact it's not all police, but there are police in the district who have been bad actors and have been going on without the proper penalties. So I do want to offer an amendment, and it seems like common sense for Black people and people of color have actually died from these restraints and saying they cannot breathe. And this amendment calls for those who say they cannot breathe to get their restraints loosened and also seek medical support. Offer this amendment, encourage my colleagues to support this first amendment. Chairman, should I go with my second amendment now or wait?
If you want to move the two together, then speak to them or otherwise wait.
All right. Great, I go with the next one while I have the floor. A second amendment shows that MP and special officers give complete and accurate facts during testimony on cases. Unfortunately, I've heard time and time again where people have been sent to jail while officers did not give adequate facts or withheld information that could have freed them during a case given to prosecutors. So this amendment seeks that when an officer is accused of providing a false statement on an official document, record, or committing perjury in a matter of involving a DC resident or any resident in the District of Columbia who died or obtained serious body injuries, the officer will be placed on administrative leave without pay until they have cleared their allegation. Additionally, when an officer has committed serious misconduct, that the officer no longer will be considered as having met the minimum standards for being an MPD officer and removed from being an employee of MPD. This will keep a lot of the bad apples from becoming police officers or continue to serve or in the District of Columbia, and now allowing technicalities to allow officer return to service. I say this because early on in 2016, I had right before getting sworn in, I know that's why I was in 2016 because I got sworn in January 2017. A senior officer came to me and was explaining to me that they had officers who had were convicted of several violations that were coming back onto the force because of the advocacy of the union. One of which officer was alleged to have sexual misconduct while on the police force. And they said that the union fought for them, they were returning back to the community to service police officers. And that's a great concern for me. And so I offer this amendment. And lastly, I do want to offer an oral commitment. I'd like to move an oral amendment, to subtitle G, section C, line 330. Move this change 330 by changing the semicolon after public safety agency to a period and inserting a new sentence that reads, if the applicant has been disciplined regarding the serious use of force, the applicant should not be eligible for employment. And it goes a little step further than what I heard from you, Chairman, earlier. The reason for this amendment is having the post board simply gathering and reviewing information does not go far enough. If the applicant had previously disciplined in other jurisdictions or other agencies regarding a serious use of force, if we don't need them as MPD officers. So I want to remove that. And again, that's section G, subtitle G, section C on line 330 of the amendment. Thank you.
This got a little bit more complicated than I expected. So I'm going to suggest that we consider them separately, the three amendments. We have the first amendment, which deals with restraints. I'll recognize Councilmember Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Councilmember White, for your work and partnership on the larger bill as well. I had a couple of questions. I want to make sure I understood the intent and how I think you perhaps envision this working. Because as I was reading it, part of what I was not quite understanding is the term restraint doesn't seem to be defined within the amendment. And so part of what we were trying to understand is when someone's being restrained by a DC law enforcement or special police officer, and then they inform they can't breathe, and I certainly understand why we're focusing here. The officer has to reposition that restraint. Would that mean, for example, if somebody was restrained, if I had both my hands behind my back and I had handcuffs on and I'm standing, but then I say I can't breathe, that they would have to reposition the restraints? And what does that mean? Or does it mean a physical restraint, as in they are keeping me, they might put me in the back of a cruiser. And so I'm restrained physically, but I'm not actually in a like a handcuff type of restraint. I think I understand the intent around it is to create a burden on the officer who is putting someone into custody to be able to understand if someone is in some type of, certainly some type of distress, that they've got to take the steps necessary to make sure that they eliminate that distress. But as written, I'm not quite sure that it's clearly defined what the restraint is and what the action is. So if I could ask you to elaborate on that, please.
Thank you. So for clarity purposes, if there's any time that a person is being detained or held by an MPD officer and expresses verbally that they can't breathe, then it's incumbent upon the officer to do whatever it needs to do to loosen those restraints or make sure the person is comfortable while in its custody at the minimum, and make sure that there's medical attention provided if in case that's the situation.
Okay. Again, I think I fully understand the intent behind it. It's how we make sure that the language gets there. The other element, I guess, or question I had is related to that medical attention, because I believe the way it was written is that the person requests medical attention, they have to be transported to an emergency medical or acute care facility within the hour. I can understand from the perspective of MPD, who's going to have a relationship, for example, with fire and EMS, but a special police officer, for example, may not have that same relationship. I also don't know how we don't say within this amendment, how would they be transported? Would that be through an ambulance? Would that be in a private vehicle? Would it be any type of medical attention that they would need to go to an emergency room? I guess, I think that I appreciate you outlining. I think that I understand the intent behind it. I'm a little concerned from the making sure that we get the amendment drafted in a way that it's very clear to what the expectations are. And I guess I'd ask if you'd be willing to work with us over the next couple of weeks, because we're going to be coming back with a temporary in 2 weeks or so, to see if there's some way we can work with you on the language regarding this, so that we make sure there's a clear expectation of what it is we would be looking at from both from the officers as well as what the citizens and residents' expectations are.
So can you ask your question for me so I can understand what the question is?
Sure. I'll I guess first start with a concern, which is because I don't think the amendment is defining what the restraint is in a way that we can create a clear line of accountability for what our shared expectations are of what should happen next. That's just a concern I have. I guess the question was on the second part of the amendment. It talks about that you've got to have medical attention within an hour. I could understand how, for example, an MPD officer might have easier access to be able to call an ambulance or others from fire and EMS, but the same doesn't really happen for an SBO or for others. How do you define within this what emergency medical transport would look like? Is it always gonna be an ambulance, be in a private vehicle? Could I put you in my car and say, let's go because I need to get you care? What is that? It's just undefined, and so it gives me a little concern. What did you?
Well, I don't agree with that part. I think that special police officers do have the option to call an ambulance. Most are equipped with a cell phone.
Yes, I'm sorry, and I apologize. Yes, I know they could call 911. I guess what I mean is there's just MPD officers are going to be able to call on a different line to request for medical transport than a special police officer is what I meant.
Was I left it broad to address the situation accordingly, depending on what the severity of the situation is. If a person can't breathe, then we want to ensure they get medical attention.
That I think I'm in 100% agreement with you on that. So I guess my question would be, if it's possible, could we work on this for the next 2 weeks? As we're going to be coming back with a temporary in 2 weeks to make sure we provide some clarity, because I think we want to make sure both for what we're asking enforcement officers, but also what we want to guarantee to residents, what their expectations are, to be able to have that with the clarity there. Would that be something you'd be willing to work with us on for the next 2 weeks and be able to bring this back in 2 weeks?
Sure.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you, Councilmember.
Okay, so amendment number 1 is withdrawn with the expectation that it may come back come back with the temporary. So amendment number 2, officers' penalties for perjury and false statements. Councilmember Allen?
Thank you. So on this one, I had a couple of quick questions on this one as well, Councilmember White. One is, if I understood correctly, it's saying that for an officer giving a false statement, it's a new crime, but I guess perjury is already a felony 10-year offense. So is the intention to create something different than what's already the perjury 10-year felony for providing that false statement and perjuring themselves, or is your intent to create a new crime different from that already exists?
Thank you. So my intention is to create more teeth in the law as relates to perjury, because I'm going to and going over the DC jail. I'm seeing people coming home recently from spending time in the federal penitentiary for over 20 years because there was an officer, and maybe those officers do not work at the police department anymore, but nonetheless, who did not exercise his or her best judgment and giving proper information during their testimony, testifying. And as a result, people have lost time with their family, lost time in their lives. And as a recent, one gentleman just came home and he did 22 years already. Well, now the officer is gone, no longer in the police department, and he just reintegrating back into society. And right now, I want to put some teeth into that. I don't know, right now, is it currently a felony?
Correct. So currently perjury it's a 10-year felony crime for a police officer. So what I was trying to understand with this was if you're trying to create something greater than that, or is the idea that using the example that you shared, which I've heard that as well, is it that how do we create some type of enforcement mechanism for an officer who wasn't prosecuted for perjury already? So a perjury that took place, but using that example, it's almost like trying to create a look back to see where perjury had taken place previously, where that officer had not been accused or convicted of that. So this may be one of your example helps me kind of think through what it is that the goal of trying to be created. This might be one that I would ask if perhaps we could also work between now and 2 weeks from now, so that we can try to make sure we understand both what do we already have on the books from the 10-year felony perjury versus if we're looking actually at officers, kind of a look back where we find that an officer had given that false statement and perjured, but had never been prosecuted or accused previously. I don't know if I'm making sense with that, but does that help distinguish between the two?
Yeah, but I guess what we're really looking for is the actual enforcement of the laws is on the books. Yeah.
Yes, well, obviously I can't
yeah, I'm not saying you can enforce
create the right way to get at the problem we're trying to solve here. And so that was one of the questions I had. Mr. Chairman, I see a few other hands going up, so I don't know if anybody else want to jump in the conversation as well.
Oh, thank you. And I don't know the order, but I see Councilmember Che wanting to be recognized. Councilmember Che?
Yes, thank you. I did have a question. In helping to understand what we're after, if it is going back to look, in other words, if the officer lied, and as a consequence of that, someone was convicted of something that they were innocent of, and we want to go back and they shouldn't be able to get away with that, what is the current, does anybody know the current statute of limitations on perjury? And perhaps if it's too brief, we should extend it in circumstances like that? Is that part of what this is about? I'm just trying to ask.
Councilmember White?
Yes, I'm not sure what the statute of limitation is on that. So I don't have the answer to that, Councilmember Che. No, but I do want to name the gap.
Is that what you're aiming at? I'm trying to figure that out. Is that what you're aiming at, being able to go back and not have somebody be able to get away with this when they committed this perjury and somebody went to jail?
So the case in which I'm referencing is gentleman David Jermaine Wilson, and there may be others that I'm hearing about consistently as I talk to people who have been convicted or facing conviction. So the thought is to go back and have some type of retribution or some type of justice in this criminal justice system.
Could I, perhaps to get to Ms. Che's question, which I understand around the statute of limitations, I don't know off the top of my head either what that statute of limitations is. One of the recommendations I might have on this amendment or request could be that if we can wait 2 weeks and come back, we could also reach out to the Criminal Code Revision Commission, CCRC, and ask for their input to help us take a look at this as well. And I think Mr. Schmeckel probably is available to help us take a look at this in relatively short order and see if we can't achieve the goal that we're trying to get, and then in a couple of weeks be able to come back through the temporary, if that would be amenable to Mr. White.
Yeah, that would work for me.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just making a note. So, so the amendment is withdrawn, and it may come back to be temporary if things get worked out. Mr. White, you had an oral amendment. That becomes more problematic. What was your oral amendment again?
My oral amendment speaks to move to change 330 on line 330 by changing the semicolon after public safety agency to period and inserting new sentence that reads, if the applicant has been disciplined regarding the serious use of force, the applicant should not be eligible for employment. While we focus on the review board, what I'm saying is that if they already had disciplinary procedures where they found guilty in another jurisdiction, we're simply saying that they're not even an eligible applicant doing this amendment to even be considered to be a police officer in our department.
And if I could ask a quick question to make sure I understand this one, Mr. Chairman. So Mr. White, earlier we had Mr. Mendelson's amendment that essentially precluded let me make sure I look at that correctly, to say that a person is ineligible for appointment as that sworn member. And do I understand correctly what your intention here is to say that they're not just ineligible for appointment, they're ineligible to even apply? Is that the gist?
Correct.
You understand?
Correct.
Okay. And then I guess a question to the chairman, does that language, I don't have the oral amendment in front of me, so as I see, Mr. Chairman, you're writing this down. Does that language then line up with your first amendment that you had proposed as well then to be able to add it to that?
Well, I'm not sure what's gained by this amendment, if I understand it. I'm assuming that the impetus for this amendment came before realizing that I was moving that amendment with regard to eligibility for to the force. And the language that I moved earlier that was accepted is very broad, that and so it would include what Mr. White is proposing. So if a person can't be appointed, I don't know why we would need to go further and say they can't apply. And I don't even know, if I think through, what effect that would have. If a person, what happens if a person applies and they shouldn't have? And of course, MPT wouldn't know until they do a background check. So there might be more to this. Since this is an oral amendment, nobody's had a chance to look at it. I would like to suggest, Mr. White, could you look at the amendment that I moved earlier that was adopted, and we could talk and see if there's something that we missed?
So, Chairman, for clarity purposes, for those who are, whoever is for those who have resigned or fired, because mine is for discipline for serious use of force.
Well, wouldn't that be included?
That's what I'm asking you.
The language we adopted earlier was a person shall be ineligible for appointment as a sworn member of the Metropolitan Police Department if he or she was previously terminated or forced to resign for disciplinary reasons from any commissioned or recruit probationary position with a law enforcement agency, or previously from a law enforcement agency to avoid potential or proposed pending adverse disciplinary action or termination.
I would add, if I can, Mr. Chairman, in my read of your amendment, I do believe that it covers what I think Councilmember White is trying to get at in terms of the use of force and any disciplinary action. Because again, there seems to be a little bit of a question on this, and I know, of course, we'll be coming back with a temporary in 2 weeks. There might be some value if I could suggest, Mr. Chairman and Mr. White and myself, that we convene and just make sure that we go through that language, that we've got 100% confidence that it's hitting what it is that we want and need it to hit in this regard. That way we can sort out the language and make sure that it's exactly where it needs to be.
I would agree. Mr. White?
For questions, real quick, Chairman. Mine's covered for those who were disciplined and terminated. I don't know if yours does the same, because I think yours just covered discipline.
You may be right, but what makes me uneasy here is that we are essentially writing as a committee, and that's never a good way to legislate. And we have an opportunity to come back at second reading on the temporary.
All right, I concede to that.
Thank you, Councilmember.
I think that completes the amendments that you were proposing, Mr. White. And I believe Mr. Gray circulated an amendment, so let me recognize him.
Am I unmuted?
I can hear you now.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm joining with my colleague, Councilmember Anita Bonds, to offer we are offering the following as an amendment to what has been a very robust and thoughtful process. I want to commend especially Councilmember Allen for the work that he has done to draft the emergency legislation that we have before us at this stage. And I appreciate the conversation that we've had up to this stage. I think it will continue to inform how we go forward with this. To that end, Mr. Chairman, I would like to offer, along with Councilmember Bonds, an amendment to the legislation. The district, as we know in the nation and as we saw at the world, has watched this whirlwind of activity that we've been engaged in over the last, at least around here anyway, over the last 2 weeks. So much of which has been spurred by the life and murder of one man, George Floyd, and the egregious situation that occurred with him. And also added to, of course, by the unjust deaths of many African Americans at the hands of law enforcement around this nation. And then so many other injustices and injuries that have been suffered by African Americans at the hands of the bullets, the batons, and other extensions of public force that we have seen mete out horrible outcomes for people who are African Americans. Let me just say too, Mr. Chairman, I stand with the peaceful protesters in the district and across the country who are fighting for justice, reform, and racial equity. The anger and resentment that has been building in response to senseless actions taken by rogue police officers is indeed valid, and we certainly know that to some extent already. Taking it to the streets in protest of unjust actions is an essential part of American democracy, and so is creating a just policy to be able to respond to injustices. You know, here in DC, I alluded to some of this about when we were talking about the number of what is the right number with police officers. Specifically in Ward 7, for example, we've seen numerous reasons for police reform. I can recall when members of the gun recovery unit conducted a warrantless search of the backyard of Denise Price, a Ward 7 resident. Was done without explanation, without any justification that I ever heard. And there was certainly the reason why they were there was requested. And I reflect back on what my colleague, Councilmember Trayon White, he mentioned Jeffrey Price. It was her son who died after his dirt bike collided with the Metropolitan Police Department cruiser. It collided under was now continued to be disputed circumstances. So, anyways, as I stated before, Mr. Chairman, I believe and I hope that my colleagues would agree that a more deliberate approach with public input is a necessary companion to the legislation that we worked very hard on, talked a lot about today. I certainly believe that public input is a necessary companion to the legislation that we are moving towards enacting today. And I don't have any question about whether there's a need for policing reforms in the District of Columbia. And I've signed on, as many as all the rest of us have, to the emergency bill, and want to add my voice to what we can do to continue to expand on what we're doing today. In any event, this legislation would establish a police reform commission. The commission shall examine and set forth recommendations on reforming and restructuring police action and public safety here in the District of Columbia. The commission, I spelled it out in what I sent out in writing earlier, would consist of 20 representatives that would include law enforcement, government agencies, nonprofit organizations, businesses, education institutions, social service organizations, religious organizations, behavioral health organizations, organized labor, and ANCs as well, Mr. Chairman. Again, consisting of 20 representatives, there would be 10 that the body would be appointed by you, Mr. Chairman, as the chair of our group, with advice and input from others as you see fit. You would be responsible for designating a chair force for the commission, and they would then be expected to report back by December 31st on the recommendations that they would, the recommendation they would advance for the city. We certainly could have a hearing in the aftermath of that. That's not included in the legislation, but I will leave that to your discretion, Mr. Chairman. So they would report by the 31st of December, which I think gives us an adequate amount of time to be able to have a robust discussion and sufficient deliberation of the findings and recommendations to be able to move forward. You know, as I listened to the discussion today, I realized how much we could benefit from having this kind of time, this kind of engagement before us. So let me ask my the co-mover, Councilmember Bonds, if she would like to add to this as we look forward to hopefully moving forward with this, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I would just like to add that given the amount of discussion that we have already been engaged in, you can just imagine what it would take to hear from many additional groups of citizens across the city that really want input. They want their voices heard, and they want us to listen. So it's not just what we feel as individuals who consider ourselves at the forefront. We want to make sure that groups that have been marching, groups that have been advocating, groups that have been active long-term also have ample opportunity to have their voices at the table and their recommendations be sincerely considered by this body. So it is in that spirit that we're proposing this amendment today, and we hope it will be accepted as a friendly amendment. Thank you. Thank you to my colleague. He did the heavy lifting, sir.
Thank you, Councilmember Bonds, Councilmember Gray, Councilmember Allen.
Thank you to Councilmember Gray and Bonds. Thank you very much for this idea, as well as for the comments and feedback along the way on the other elements of the larger bill. I guess I had just a couple of quick questions to make sure I understood kind of the intention here. Is the idea from a where would this commission be housed in your vision of kind of how this would get created? Is this a something that's run through the Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety? Is it something that's run through the Committee of the Whole or the Council? Is it run through something external to the body? That part just is unclear to me as to essentially where we house it and how we staff it.
Okay.
I don't discount what the certainly the good intention and work of what could be good ideas. Just more of a process and function question.
I guess if I might just take the lead on responding very quickly, it seems to me that this is a universal issue. It is about judiciary, it is about public safety, but when we think about those terms in the broader sense, it's almost like it is housed within the Committee of the Whole. And no disrespect to the great work that gets done through judiciary, but I think this is an opportunity for all of us to have input, and we all want to have input. And so I think if the chairman of the council is going to make some of these appointments, that it makes sense that we do it through the Committee of the Whole, and then we equally share in this process.
No, I would concur with that. I think having it, conducted through the Committee of the Whole is, to me, is an appropriate way to do this. we want to engage every one of our colleagues, all, which will soon be, I guess, 13 of us working on these issues. And I think Councilmember Bonds is absolutely right that we want to be able to widen this net as much as we possibly can, so that those who want to be heard from can do this in an organized way, which is exactly what the commission would do. And then we will have a set of recommendations articulated in writing and be available to us. If we choose to have a hearing in the aftermath of that, it would be up to our chair, Chairman Mendelson, to do that. Might be an appropriate thing to do to set those recommendations out in front of everybody. But I do think too that having this run through the committee of the whole is probably the appropriate way to do this.
Thank you. If I can just respond to that a little bit. And again, I appreciate it. Yeah, one of the things that I've talked about a good bit over these last few days and have been struck by it, I think I hear this consistently with my colleagues as well, is that there's an element of this that certainly is a policing and criminal justice reform. There is also a part of this, though, that is around racial justice, and that goes well beyond, of course, judiciary and public safety. And we know these are elements around housing reform, education reform, workforce reform. So, and I think I heard you kind of echoing a lot of that as well. And I don't mean this in a territorial way, what I mean is if we're gonna create something that is on policing reform, then I would suggest that that might be something that's better suited within the committee, although I am concerned just from a, as we hit the end of a session and just kind of a bandwidth perspective. If, however, we want to create this around, which I think actually sounds consistent with what you're talking about, it's more of a racial justice commission, that we understand the intersection between so many different issues. And I've heard so many of my colleagues talk about this. If we want to focus it on a racial justice reform, and I've heard so many of my colleagues talk so much better than I can about these issues, that seems like that might be a better fit for the committee of the whole if we take it into that space. I think it could help us with some of the equity work that Mr. McDuffie has helped launch here at the council as well. It feels like if we wanted to broaden the scope a little bit to talk about, again, a racial justice commission, that's a good fit for the committee of the whole. And as I heard you outline your vision around some of the different appointees, that seems like that might fit well. So I guess I'd kind of turn it back as a question to see, is that consistent with the view and vision of what you're trying to create, or is it a more narrow scope of looking at something that is police reform related?
Well, at least from my perspective, Councilmember Allen, racial justice is obviously a component of it, but I think it goes further than that. And that's what precipitated us coming together to try to craft this in the first place, and that is, yes, racial justice has to be a component of it, has to be looked at, but what has precipitated a lot of this is the public safety issues that we are here and elsewhere, but especially here, we're grappling with every day. And this whole bill that we're crafting today is really centered around public safety. So I would want to keep, in my personal view, is I want to keep it focused on public safety, police reform. But yeah, there's no question that a huge component of that has to be the consideration of racial justice in making the recommendations and the decisions to go forward. And that's why when we came together to lay out the various areas, that's why it included issues focused on racial justice, but also police reform as well. So I think at the end of the day, we'll get a set of recommendations that will encompass the police reform and encompass racial justice as well. So that's the purpose of going forward with the commission, trying to do it in a fairly expeditious way so that we can move forward as quickly as possible. We'd have the folks appointed by hopefully the middle of July, and then move forward with having a set of recommendations in hand hopefully to act upon by the end of December.
Okay. But if I can, just two quick responses, that I might have other colleagues that want to jump in. The first is I hear you on public safety, and that's kind of what's driving some of the conversation. I think one of the things that I'm certainly hearing from voices is that public safety is beyond policing, that public safety, again, is going to be around our housing, it is around our education. There's so much more. So to me, there's a potential here of really broadening this a bit, which could have a lot of benefits to us as we collectively work and realize that the journey that we are on, as I think we've all talked about, today is a huge step forward, but that we have so many more steps to take. That type of commission centered around racial justice can help us collectively kind of see across all of our committees and the work that we have in front of us. The second piece, and is just more, I want to flag this as a little bit of a concern, as we are about to go through a budget cycle where we are going to be proposing significant changes through the budget. I would not want a commission that's going to report at the end of the calendar year as a tool that some people might say, well, let's not take some decisions, or let's not make some big decisions right now. Let's wait until we go through this commission process and we don't kind of meet the moment of the change that we need to make. So just kind of want to flag those two things, but I don't know if other colleagues want to jump in. I probably exceeded my time there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, I hesitate to jump in, but I think I'm going to, just because I'm aware of some thoughts that have been conveyed to me by others. Councilmember Allen, you're not saying you're for or against this amendment, which is a little bit challenging, but you're raising concerns similar to how you approached the previous three amendments. I know that there's one member who's uneasy about how this was circulated. I could ask if all members have a copy of this amendment, because I know it's not linked in the agenda. I became aware of this yesterday evening, and I know that a draft was circulated yesterday evening. Now, we can spend another half an hour debating this. We could simply decide that we're going to move forward with this, or we could agree that this will get worked out a bit more and come back for second reading on the temporary. Let me ask Mr. Gray. Let me be clear that I am aware that there's at least one member who has an objection because this was not circulated yesterday afternoon. And my concern as chair is that we could end up debating this another half hour, and I don't know that we all want to do that. Mr. Gray, I'm kind of putting you on the spot at the moment.
Well, I think this is pretty straightforward, Mr. Chairman, and as you know, you and I had a chance to talk about this last evening.
True.
I don't think there's anything nearly as complicated about this, as there is about some of the other issues that we have debated this morning and this afternoon. So I don't see anything that would preclude us, our colleagues, being able to move forward with what Councilmember Bonds and I have proposed. And this, again, is pretty straightforward, I think, in terms of the composition. It's pretty straightforward in terms of, coming back together by the end of the year. Pretty straightforward to echo, again, what Councilmember Bonds said, that we work through the committee of the whole. That is a mechanism that we use oftentimes to get things done in a very efficient way, in my opinion, on this council. So I don't see anything that would preclude us from being able to move forward. And, Councilmember Bonds wants to add to that. I certainly welcome it, but I don't see anything that slows us down at all, Mr. Chairman. In fact, I think this is an efficient way to be able to move forward with the business at hand, and that is we have myriad issues around public safety and police reform that need to be discussed. We probably discussed maybe half a dozen of those today, I could multiply that by another 20 or 30, and we could be here for the rest of the afternoon. What we were looking for was a way to be able to capture this. It has an energy already behind it and will allow us bringing together people who will have an opinion no matter what. But we're trying to organize this in a way that would allow those opinions to be expressed, allow that input to come back to the council, and give us something that we can act on in terms of true reform. I think the last thing any of us wants is to wind up with a Band-Aid, approach to this. I know what I want to see is real reform. I hear about issues constantly from the people of Ward 7, and we need more police, we need less police, we need more of a variety of things. This will give a place for these things to be discussed, to be chronicled, and then brought back before this body for action, Mr. Chairman. So I think we should move forward with it. I'm giving a lot of thought to this, especially since we've seen what happened with, the folks who were protesting last week and last several weeks. I think there's just enormous momentum that we need to capture in an organized way in the city, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'm remembering that we should be mindful of the time. Mr. Allen, if I may call on you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, several of us have.
Yeah, I think I've said my piece so far around what I think here, but happy to turn to some of my colleagues.
Okay, let me just repeat. We can debate this for another half hour, or we could try to figure out how we get through this more quickly. Mr. Robert White, did you want to be recognized?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I really appreciate Councilmember Gray and Councilmember Bonds raising this amendment. I think that there are two really important things that they are capturing. One is the need to amplify voices. That's something that I've been very vocal about. We as a body don't have all the answers here. The other piece is making sure that we capture and push forward this momentum. There are a couple concerns that I have that I would like to talk through. One is I'm concerned that, and Councilmember Allen raised some of this, I'm concerned that as we move through the budget, with the momentum that we have now and the demands that we're seeing every minute in our emails, that some members may get hesitant to take necessary and bold steps forward because we're waiting on a report. Most of us are well aware of the Kerner report that followed the 1968 rise. That's been 50 years, and we're still waiting for the implementation of that. So if we miss the budget cycle, we have missed our opportunity here to act. And I just don't want any of us to let ourselves off the hook on that issue because we can point to some forthcoming report. And that is incredibly important to me. It's incredibly important to a lot of you. It's incredibly important to our residents. The other thing that I would raise is that I wonder if we can work together